We weren't meant to go ahead and stand for that, sit for that long. It's not healthy.
Exactly.
It's not. Good morning. We're going to continue our hearing on HB 1176, and we'll just pick it up where we left off yesterday. I want to thank. We try to do these things in terms of chunks of time, and I had hoped to have the full prosecutor chunk of time yesterday, and all the folks who were in that community, and but we just couldn't for time purposes. Although I think we had a great dialogue yesterday. I've talked with members of the committee, and we all learned a lot yesterday. And that's what this is about. It's knowing what you know, but more importantly, knowing what you don't know, and listening and learning, and then hopefully leading after that. That's the name of the game. So I appreciate the perspective today. I have no reason to believe it'll be any different. Yesterday, I have no reason to believe me or anyone else that it'll be different today. With that, let me go ahead and call Chuck Spahas, who represents the Georgia Association of Solicitors General. And I said that right. It's like Solicitors General as opposed to Solicitor Generals. Is that right?
It's actually written in the code two different ways. So
well, that doesn't surprise me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. Obviously the solicitors share the concerns that have been outlined by the district attorneys, but there's a couple of things that are specific to the misdemeanor world that we want to discuss. So basically, I represent today the prosecutors that are going to inherit this bulk of cases that were original felonies and now are going to be misdemeanors. And I'm going to ask this committee to consider giving us a few tools if we're going to do that. As the chairman is aware, we've had discussions in the past about the fact that there's been a growing number of states that have recognized the need for a tiered misdemeanor punishment, where our definition of misdemeanor, of course, is 12 months, any sentence that's 12 months or less. We're going to propose that there would be a need, particularly in light of these added cases that are going to have higher amounts of restitution, higher amounts of fines, and that kind of thing to be collected, that we should seriously consider taking, for instance, our definition of a high and aggravated misdemeanor and make that a 24-month sentence, up to a 24-month sentence. And again, I can at some point provide you some other states that have done similar tiered types of punishment. But that would make it much more feasible for several aspects of that, specifically collecting restitution. When you start talking about restitution of up to $1,000 in these cases, I think you heard somebody speak yesterday that realistically most of these people, when you start getting above about $200 or $250 a month of whatever cost it would be, restitution, probation, whatever, that's just about all they're capable of doing. And they need more time. State courts traditionally have done a good job of collecting court costs and court-appointed attorney's fees and that kind of thing if we've got enough time to do it. So I would submit that that would be a good reason to seriously consider that. Also, keep in mind that some of these offenders that you're giving us, while we've heard good conversations about drug courts and mental health courts, there are also those kinds of alternatives that are present in the state courts, including our DUI courts. And I could envision in the future an expansion of those kind of courts to deal with the same offenders that are now in misdemeanor court as opposed to were in superior court. So the longer amount of time would make those kind of cases easier to manage too, because the typical stay in a DUI court is similar. It's up to 18 months to sometimes 24 months. So I ask you to seriously consider giving us a tool like that. The other thing that I bring to the court's attention, we have a pretrial intervention statute in Georgia that allows a prosecutor to set a program up that oftentimes takes place prior to conviction, oftentimes outside of the presence of the court, that allows us to structure something very similar to a sentence that allows often a youthful offender or a first-time offender to complete certain conditions as if they were sentenced, including community service, counseling, restitution.
It's a diversion program.
A diversion program,
okay.
Yes, sir.
Right.
A diversion program, and specifically it's set up by OCGA 15-1880. And it's managed, in my particular office, it's managed by two people in my office that actually supervise these people just as if they are on probation. One of the things that I see with the added thefts and the forgeries and what have you would be a a greater section or population of people that may very well be eligible for that type of diversion program. Allowing, of course, a youthful offender or somebody to complete that and have it not only off their record but expunged off their record in the end if that's agreed to. And that's just under the current expungement scheme. So I submit that the one problem that we've got in that statute, and if the chairman will remember, we passed a bill, or you passed a bill last year out of the House that would allow us to raise the fee that is collected from $300, which is what is in the statute, up to $1,000. Just thinking that was consistent with the misdemeanor punishment if the case was prosecuted. And what it does is it allows us to have the offender, quite frankly, pay for the system to manage it. Yep. And I would submit that this would be an appropriate time to revisit that issue because, again, we want to at least pay for the system that we're allowing these offenders to avail themselves of.
But do we price our, do we price ourselves out of the market at some point in doing that if we raise that from X to Y? I mean, we're talking about what do you propose in terms of going from what to what?
Well, it's currently $300, and the bill that we passed out last year, raised it to $1,000.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we're going to collect $1,000 in all those cases, but the problem we have now is if, for instance, I take an offender and they become convicted of a theft, and they get a $1,000 fine and community service and all this other stuff, they pay all that while they're on there. If I create this system, which I'm not required to do, to let them avail themselves of this pre-adjudication sentence-like structure that allows them not to be convicted in the end, I can't collect even a third of the amount of money that they would have had to pay had they been convicted. So I have a hard time sometimes justifying, at least to the financial people that I have to talk to about the way I run my office, about why that's such a less amount of money, or a lesser amount of money than we'd get if we simply just convicted them. Now, that's fine. I'm elected to do make these kind of decisions, but I submit that if we could at least raise that pretrial intervention fee to an amount that at least equates to what that system costs to run, that would be appropriate. If
you could submit that in writing to Ms. Bazemore and or Mr. Wasatowski right there, that would be great.
Okay. I will submit both.
And I will guidance.
Take any questions.
On the 24-month, that's confined to just the high and aggravate? Because I know, part of our conversation yesterday was on, in light of the fact that if we raise this threshold, that means by definition you're going to have more people coming through state court in your world, and by definition spending more time at the county jail, or as I call in Cobb County, the Neil Warren Hotel. We wanted to do is to go ahead and at least have the possibility of more of an upward departure in fines in order to help offset that what is inevitably an increased cost, and we just need to be honest about that. Is that confined just to high and aggravated, or is that a situation where we need to take a look at the possibility of of not just high and aggravated, but just a regular misdemeanor going up to more than 12 months?
Well, either approach would accomplish what I'm telling you is the problem. 12 months is just simply not enough time for the average individual coming through our system to pay it.
Right.
I would suggest that another means, if you've got a high and aggravated definition, which you've got now, the only thing it means of substance to be a high and aggravated misdemeanor, quite frankly, is the computation that the sheriff uses for good time served, as we were discussing yesterday. That's the only real distinction that it makes in a criminal sentence.
And does not allow for the 2-for-1?
That's correct. Only I think 4 days a month. Now, it has the increased fine amount. It goes up to $5,000, but it still is only 12 months. And you can give a $5,000 fine and try to collect it over 12 months, but I submit that you're not going to. So that's just an avenue. I can submit several different approaches to it, whether it would be a tiered or simply a 24-month misdemeanor, and that's the new definition, or if we use high and aggravated as the place to do that. I submit we probably don't need a 24-month misdemeanor across the board.
Okay.
So either way, but we can submit both for the committee's consideration.
It would be good to get a suggested roadmap on that. Would be helpful.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How much interest in state court? I've been to some of the state DUI courts, for example, and visiting it, and I love what they're doing. How much interest do you think on that state court level is there in expanding some accountability courts in the state court?
I think there is now there is a very open-minded approach from the state court bench and from the Solicitor General's. I'll start out by telling you I was one that resisted the DUI court for several years. I'm a cop turned prosecutor that thought we should be holding people accountable and locking people up for these kind of things, and resisted it in my county. For several years, I was the roadblock for it being in Henry County. But I continued to listen to the dialogue amongst the participants that were actually having those programs, running those programs, and I quite frankly started analyzing the statistical data about their success rates and the impact they were having on recidivism, and gave in and said, okay, I'm not going to be the barricade to this if it works. And we have implemented it in our county. We have had some real success in the short period of time we're doing. And I think I am not the only prosecutor in this state that has become more open-minded about that, and I think you're seeing a lot more of that.
You just in less than 2 minutes, I think, spelled out very clearly the importance of what we're doing, because we have assumptions that are ingrained in us that we believe is the best way to hold people accountable, and that's through punishment. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of our efforts at holding accountable through punishment has increased expenditures without increasing public safety, without reducing recidivism. And by opening up, as you've done, and allowing the statistical data to confront your ingrained opinions, and see that by doing some of this with the right offenders, by those who assess out, by doing this, we're still holding them accountable, very, very much so holding them accountable. But we're doing it in a cost-effective manner that improves results and ultimately improves public safety. And that's what this dialogue, when we initiated this dialogue last year, the purpose of it was to get to that point to where we do a better job holding them accountable, do a better job with taxpayer dollars, do a better job with reducing recidivism and public safety, and that summed it all up right there. Thank you very much.
I told you I'd be brief, Mr. Chairman.
And I told you that brevity was great, but don't miss the point, and you nailed the point with your brevity, and thank you so much.
A seasoned professional. Thank you, Mr. Spahouse. Appreciate it. Let me call Bob Dallas, who was the director of the Governor's Office of Highway Safety, to speak briefly. I know you've got a time commitment, so I wanted to make sure we got you in there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am Bob Dallas, an attorney by trade and former director of the Highway Safety Office under Governor Perdue. And I just briefly want to talk about accountability courts from the perspective I had, where I served for about 5 years on the National Association of Drug Court Professionals DUI committee. And that was chaired by Kent Lawrence, whom many of you know is a state court judge here, who I look at as the grandfather for DUI courts in Georgia. We call these accountability courts because it takes a lot of time to hold the offender accountable. But there's another part of the equation, and that is holding the courts accountable to the fidelity of the process. What I mean by that is we spent a lot of time developing 10 steps that we felt were very important for the courts to follow to ensure that the results would be there. And it was important for us to set these steps out because we wanted to make it clear amongst the courts throughout the country that while we embrace flexibility, the local control, the subjectivity that a judge has to apply to every single case, we did know that certain things had to happen in order for the results to be there. And so by establishing these criteria, we felt then courts who call themselves DUI courts would produce the results that were necessary. What we did not want was a court to put on the label without putting on the work, because in that instance, the result would be poor results for the offenders, but it would also tarnish the system for those courts who do well. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, we set the standards, and I think any accountability court should have standards, which then begs the next question, which is how do you ensure fidelity to the standards? And in that regard, I do believe accountability also includes ensuring that the courts follow the processes that are set up, whether it's through a commission or however they're set up for a DUI court versus a veterans court versus a drug court. The fact of the matter is these courts do need to follow certain things, applying their local circumstances. And in that regard, the question I know has been raised, should it be an outside organization? Should it be peers? I tend to follow on the peer side, and this is why. Judges probably hold themselves in high esteem, as many of us do in the profession. When a peer comes to you and looks at you, you want to do a good job. So from my observation, the peer review process is probably a good one, recognizing, though, that any process that we put in place does need to be reviewed externally to ensure fidelity to the process. And with that, I'm more than happy to answer any questions the committee might have. And I do say thank you to the legislature and the governor for looking at these, because it will be for the betterment of Georgia.
I think we tend to agree with you that we go down a dangerous path when we start mandating best practices amongst those who are actually doing a job that we're not doing. You know, when you have people like Kent Lawrence and George Krieger and Melody, well, of course, George Krieger does a drug court in Cobb. I'm thinking of Melody Clayton and others in the Cobb State Court doing established, well-run DUI courts. I mean, there's been some trial and error, like with any organization, but we probably do better to err on the side of a peer review. But also pair that with best practices, so it's not just, you know, the Wild West out there, people just making it up as they go.
It's exactly right, Mr. Chairman. I know as a highway safety office, we would give out grants, and we had the opportunity to ensure fidelity to the process in the DUI court spectrum. But independent of that, when courts were put on the label, the concern always was to ensure that they recognize this is more than just a label. It's a lot of work on the part of the court, which produces these great results.
Thank you, Mr. Dallas.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Is Oliver Hunter with the Georgia Sheriff Association here?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Mr. Hunter, please come on up. I know you signed up late yesterday. That's all right. We wanted to make sure we got, and with Mr. Spahos's comments earlier about the 2-for-1 time and those operational issues, in looking at the possibility of high and aggravated on some crimes in order to help facilitate on the cost side for what will inevitably be more traffic in the county jails. I think it's a natural segue into what comments you may have if you want to address that, or if you don't, that's fine too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm Oliver Hunter, General Counsel for the Sheriff Association. We see the criminal justice reform as probably one of the most important issues we'll face this session, and we are very happy to participate in this discussion, in this dialogue. Just where as a backdrop, Sheriff's Office enforce all the criminal laws, not all, but the criminal laws, the traffic and civil laws, and there are 148 jails in our state. Jails presently house over 40,000 inmates, and we transport about 20,000 mental health patients a year. As I said earlier, we really want to assist this committee as discussions move along, but we are very concerned about the implications that are there as we roll out the criminal justice reform. I speak more specifically in terms of the increased number of probationers. You spoke earlier about having an honest discussion, and I think if we indeed are honest, we realize that we really have an inadequate number of probation officers presently to serve that population. And here we're talking about increasing the class of probationers, and we are concerned that what resources we put in place to make sure that class of people, increased class probationers, is addressed. One thing I want to add to as well, when we talk about probationers and the revocation of probationers, those folks are revoked, they're revoked back to the county jails, okay? And that's where they'll serve the balance of their term in the county jails. Not only do we not receive a per diem from the state for those folks who serve their time in county jails as a result of revocation of probation, we get $0 for those people. And I think we were talking about, and our concern, quite frankly, and I'm just being very honest about it.
Sure,
here,
please.
Is that we're potentially looking at perhaps not saving dollars, but shifting cost, you know, as we shift the cost from the state level to the local level. And I just want to make sure that we're very mindful of the implications on the county jails as we make some of these changes. I think, you know, and I don't mean to get off the point, but I think there's some lessons to be learned here from the mental health side of this whole equation as we enter into the agreement with the Justice Department about how to address our mental health issues. I think it's important that we recognize that we make sure some of the resources are in place before we try to implement some things that are dependent upon the success of resources. If you proceed, quite frankly, in many instances, before there are adequate resources in place, it calls for a great deal of confusion, and the integrity of the system is put into question. So I caution respectfully that we think long and hard, that we make sure that we have adequate resources in place, and the implications of some of the things we do before we roll out some of these programs. And some of the things are fairly obvious again. We're talking, as the solicitor spoke earlier, we're increasing the number of our misdemeanors to some extent here. And these folks, for the most part, are going to serve their time in county jails. So I just want to be mindful that we have over 40,000 inmates presently. We're looking at probably increasing, as a result of these reforms, increasing those numbers pretty substantially, and that we look at both the issue of not having paid any per diem for those who were revoked by the county jail, but also looking at those who are there because of state offenses. We do like the idea of electronically transmitting that the data. We had a bill of our own a year or two ago that would have required that, but it went nowhere. And the fear was, I think, on the state part, that somehow receiving that information more timely resulted in paying the per diem more quickly. But the bottom line is that in this day and age, there's just no reason why we ought to be submitting those packages by way of regular mail. And we're very happy to see the reform recognize that transmitting electronically is the way to go. One thing, I'll be brief here again too.
It's okay. We want to hear from you.
One other thing that I didn't see anything that would address this. I don't think it's not impacted. I hope it's not impacted. What we spoke of earlier about the earned time that sheriffs can give 4 days a month. Make sure that we are careful that we don't do anything to take that flexibility away, because as we look at growing numbers, we're going to need increased flexibility on the local level to make sure that we can manage jail populations. So
what I'm hearing is, if we're going to go ahead and make something that's now a misdemeanor, high and aggravated misdemeanor for whatever reason, that we go ahead and at the same time make sure that the sheriffs have the ability in terms of whatever it is, good time, 2 for 1 time, whatever it is, that follows along in alignment to allow for management.
Right, because that's a management tool that sheriffs have to manage the jail population, and I didn't see or read anything that really directly impacted that. But as we proceed along, make sure we're very mindful that we do nothing to.
Well, I mean, if something goes to a high and aggravated misdemeanor, from what I've been educated about, it does impact your ability to go ahead and give 2 for 1 time from a management standpoint.
Exactly.
If that's not clear in the bill, perhaps it should be.
Well, that's one of the things that I get without, because perhaps I wasn't clear about that, but I'm saying if you're going to change that, you're also changing our ability to manage that jail population, because we won't have the ability to make those kinds of management decisions. And
of course, that's discretionary on the part of the sheriff.
Precisely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, and appreciate your work on behalf of the sheriffs, and obviously the sheriffs play a huge role in what we're trying to do, and there's no question, and you touched on this, there's no question that the criminal justice system, the way that it is underfunded on local levels. It's underfunded on probation levels. We talked with DAs yesterday. We have big caseloads with parole, probation, DA's office. The jails are crowded. We have a lot of issues that we're dealing with when it relates to funding. The very real fact that we're facing is our prison population continues to expand, and it's going to continue to drain more and more of that funding toward corrections. And right now we're over $1 billion a year in corrections out of an $18 billion budget. as we're looking at what we're doing in criminal justice reform, we're looking at how we can hold people accountable in the most efficient and effective way, reducing recidivism and increasing public safety. And the way we've been doing it for the last 2 decades is not the way to do it. We can't. It's unsustainable to continue going the way we're going. There are a number of things that we looked at, and it's interesting as we talk about different things like going from misdemeanor to high and aggravated misdemeanor, how as we make tweaks to our proposals, every time we make a tweak here, it impacts here and here and here as well. And I think that's a very important thing to consider is we can't just make tweaks based on what our assumptions are or our beliefs are. We have to look at and see how that impacts the data. Unfortunately, we've got somebody right here in Georgia, John Spear, that has a great handle on how to tweak that. And as we're looking at reducing the spending in corrections, there are several things that we're looking to do with that. And one of those is reinvesting those savings in ways that creates greater public safety. And probation is a great place to begin. Our probation officers are the caseload's incredible with our probation officers. In the state of Georgia, our average offender spends twice as much time on probation as the national average. And there are a number of things that we're looking at doing with criminal justice reform to where when we put all of these pieces together, including increasing some opportunities within probation, I think you'll see those probation officers being able to better manage their caseload, first of all, have a better manageable caseload, and be able to manage it better with the tools that we're giving them. There are a number of things that we're also doing that I think will impact the county jails. And you touched on mental health, and I know yesterday when we had the mental health court testimony of Judge Gosselin and Judge Goss, they talked about the importance of impacting that mental health community. And I think it was Judge Goss that said, if you take an offender that's going to the county jail 3 times a year and spending 120 days, if you can reduce that to 1 time a year and spend 30 days, you've made a real impact. So there are things that can be done from every angle that helps with the burden on county jails. One of the things that we're looking at with our proposal is that we create performance incentive funding projects that allow some of the savings on the correction side to go to those local jurisdictions that are being effective in the way they handle their offenders, reducing recidivism. We're going to look at giving additional funds to those local counties that are doing things right, so that they can continue down that path of reduced recidivism. You touched on the electronic information system being a good thing. There's a couple other things as well. One of the things that I know, there are a lot of offenders in the county jails that are waiting on beds at PDCs. And PDCs were never intended to be used for 1 and 2 year sentences. They were intended to be used for short sentences, and a lot of that use of the PDCs is being extended out. One of the things that we're looking at doing is capping sentences on those PDCs, so that those offenders are not occupying those beds for as long a period of time, which will help reduce some of the load on county jails. Do you see that as a way to help eliminate a little bit of that load on your county jails?
I think putting a cap will help.
Okay.
Will help. Yes, sir.
Okay. Another thing, I think there's probably quite a few offenders in the county jails that are waiting on RSAT beds. And another thing that the governor's doing with this 13 budget is providing the funds for the Department of Corrections to add 600 additional RSAT beds to the current RSAT program within the Department of Corrections, which will allow even more of those offenders that are occupying county jails to be able to move out quicker and into those RSAT. Will that help some as well?
Sir, we're at a point where almost anything helps.
Okay.
You know, and we're at that point. So, will it be a substantial? I really am not prepared to say that, but the numbers, to the extent that we can get folks out of county jails of which we receive no per diem at all, or per diem that's really inadequate to reimburse it for costs, it will certainly be of help. Yes, sir.
Another proposal is 12 new day reporting centers. The availability of those new day reporting centers will also allow individuals that are in county jails to get out of those jails and into that program with probation and day reporting centers. That'll ease the impact somewhat as well.
I think all those things.
Okay.
But we really appreciate the work of the committee. I mean, I want to be very clear about that, and we understand where you're trying to go, and we applaud that and support that. My only reason to make the comments that I did make, and it wasn't to disparage probation, it was just a recognition of the fact that the numbers of officers who serve that population is insufficient. And we're talking about increasing that class of folks, probationers. We need to also simultaneously look at increasing the number of officers who are there to serve that population.
Yeah.
And
we agree on that,
yeah,
by the way.
And I just being honest about it, I think you understand the honesty there, and we just not picking a fight with anybody. It's just reality.
Yeah.
And so all those things you talked about certainly will help. But we always maybe a discussion for another day, because we understand the probation officer will still obviously supervise felon probationers, but you also increasing the class of private misdemeanor probationers. Okay, and that class is substantially served by private probationers officers.
And that's a discussion that the council felt like was not part of their charge.
Right.
And I think the governor's going to keep, with the executive order, a council together, and I believe they're going to look at that this year.
I think that really exacerbates, I think, the situation that we're dealing with now. And I just lay that out there as a recognition that we need to, at some point, pretty quickly look at the results that's created by the reform and increase the numbers of folks who have been served by private probation officers.
Can I get you to go a little bit further on a point that you made? You get zero reimbursement for a revoked probationer?
That's correct, sir.
I had no idea.
$0. Well,
I'm not sure what we need to do, but we need to do something about that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No problem. I'm done. And unless there's some questions, I appreciate the chance to appear before the committee. And again, thank you for your work. Thank you for where we're headed in terms of trying to reform, make some reforms that are long overdue, we believe, and we want to be a part of that discussion, part of the work of moving us in that direction.
We appreciate your perspective. That's what we're looking for is the on-the-ground, real-world impact of what we're about to do. And, we don't want the law of unintended consequences to kick in. There are consequences from an increased cost and increased jail population. There's no getting around that. The question is, are we going to, number one, acknowledge it, and then are we going to go ahead and address it? My sense is that it's not an all-at-once addressing, but it'll probably be incremental over time if I had to take a guess. But we can't stick our heads in the sand on that.
It all starts with a discussion. That's what.
Yeah, there's no sticking our heads in the sand on that thing, and funding. Funding's a huge component of that. There's no getting around it. So thank you so much.
Thank
for your
you.
perspective.
Can I follow up one
Sure.
real quick? Zero reimbursement on felony or misdemeanor or both, or
both. Those folks who are under a state supervision and who go through probation revocation, and as a result will spend their time in county jail, there is $0 per diem reimbursement.
For both felony and misdemeanor?
I know for felony, I believe for misdemeanor as well.
All right. I'm gonna look into that a little bit more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Let me ask Clint Austin with the Retail Association if he's in the room. He is. Are your folks ready, Mr. Austin? Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. Is Sarah Tatanchi here? Okay, you're on the on-deck circle, just to let you know.
Mr. Chairman, Clint Austin, representing the Georgia Retail Association today. Thank you and the committee for your time. First, we want to open by saying we support very much the overall intent of criminal justice reform effort. That addressing drug-related crime problems goes to much of the core of our problem, because I think as everybody knows, retailers are victimized often to finance drug problems. And so new, creative, more effective approaches to the drug problem are something we wholeheartedly support and look forward to partnering with at the state and community level with so many of the people who testified over the last 2 days. What we want to do is give you some of the experience we have with two of the specific proposals in the legislation and in the report that relate to the raising of the felony threshold level on shoplifting and on theft by taking. In addition, of course, for me with the Retail Association, Kathy is here with Georgia Food Industry Association. We work together on a lot of these issues, and I think they want to, and Kathy will speak for herself, of course, but sort of echo what we want to do in providing experiences that help you draw that balance. Like you were saying yesterday, Mr. Chairman, that y'all got to make a very important, delicate cost-benefit analysis as you make the many decisions that are going to go behind this legislation. And we want to give you the perspective of, so to speak, the victims of the retail crime, property crime side of this thing on the theft thresholds, and so you can make the most appropriate cost-benefit analysis decision that you can make. Retail crime is a major problem for our members on the scale of $30 billion a year. And it's not a victimless crime. First, you see the scale of the problem, but in addition, that much like, with the exception of small business, I'll put a finger on that and come back to it. But much like with taxes, that most folks believe there are no real taxes on business. It's ultimately taxed to the consumer. There's not a lot of crime is not a real crime against the business. It's passed on to the consumer. The cost of bearing that crime and building it into the cost of goods. Where I want to come back to immediately is with small businesses, the scale of the crime problem, particularly organized retail crime, is such that many small businesses go under. They get hit one time hard, and they just don't have insurance to cover that kind of stuff. And so to the extent that state policy decisions influence how the burden that retailers have to bear with theft, because it is an everyday problem. You got to deal with it. It's, again, part of the cost of your goods and keeping your doors open. That want to give you some background on that. Our main point we want to leave you with is that we believe that that criminals, particularly organized retail crime, will orient their activities around the threshold, whatever that is. An example would be, or the abstract of what you're looking at, is that you'll have an organized retail criminal who'll pick himself up 4 or 5 boosters on the street and say, go into this establishment and steal up to the shoplifting limit in Georgia right now is $300. Steal $290, and spread around 4 or 5 folks. Of course, the total effect on the business is greater than that, but that avoids a felony count if somebody gets caught. Of course, it's a segmented operation. They're not going to tell who the other guys are operating, and our guys get hit hard, and it's a major issue to the extent that, and again, the chairman has been very gracious to listen to some of the feedback we've given to this point. This was an issue in last year's General Assembly. Chairman Hamrick and Chairman Mullis introduced Senate Bill 243 on the organized retail crime issue. We would commend to the committee that you consider some of the things that were in Senate Bill 243 as a possible add to your effort, but that organized retail crime is a real problem. And what I just described to you goes back to our point that a lot of times the felony limit just serves as a cap or a control on criminal behavior. They know what it is, and they want to stay right under it. And that I want to say a concern, but that something that ought to go into your cost-benefit analysis, that is, as you raise those thresholds, how is that going to affect criminal behavior that orients itself around the thresholds that may not necessarily be contributing to how many felons you have in prison beds, but it might certainly tend to increase the cost to retailers downstream. As the chairman's pointed out, the limits have not been adjusted in 20 years, 30 years. An inflationary factor is something that it makes sense for the committee to look at. But when you look at that inflationary factor, if you just go back to a CPI index from '82, we think you may be looking at something more like a 2-fold increase rather than a 2.5 or 3-fold increase.
Well, that's my question: is what part of the approach was to bring some uniformity to the theft statutes and some consistency, as opposed to having these different thresholds in different areas. And there was one that stuck out in my mind about if it's a motor vehicle or a motor vehicle part, $300 or more. I don't know where that came from, but and that's probably a vestige of a bygone era, I would think. But we got a recommendation for some consistency, so that you're not having to look back, and that helps in the courtroom. I think it helps probably Mr. Spahos's people inordinately. That doesn't mean it's absolutely correct either. But anyway, that was part of the motivation, and of course, just the update, since it has been effectively 30 years, and this is a different world now. By the same token, while other states have gone to thresholds like 1,500 and 2,000 and 2,500, we did want to be more sensitive, candidly, to to large retailers, not the least of which is the Home Depot, which has their store support center conveniently located on Paces Ferry Road in the greater Vining-Smyrna area.
You said it, Mr. Chairman, not me.
That you can do it. We can help. That being
Home Depot is a key member of our association as well.
That being said, that doesn't mean that it's absolutely written in stone, but I mean there has to be a basis for it, and that leads to my serious question of where. And I don't want to put you on the spot right now, but if the Retail Association has a specific suggestion about where a variation on that $1,000 consistency could and should come, we're all ears, and just to provide a substantive basis for that. I'm not necessarily asking you to spit that out right now, but just to think about it, perhaps over the weekend, next couple of days, next week, and to make a suggestion on that. Because I think almost everything, really, in the bill is discussable, and that's the way it ought to be, especially with a big ticket item like this. This is no different. Right. So, but that's our rationale, and we'd rather err. I think a lot of people on this side want to go ahead and err on the side of caution. But again, it all goes back to listening and learning. So don't hesitate to give us that, and it'll be given every consideration I know. And Ms. Kasaba, did you want to?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And although we don't have Home Depot, Kathy Kazava, and I represent the Georgia Food Industry Association, and all of you know we represent the grocers, everybody from the Publix, the Krogers, the Walmarts, on down to the independents, the small mom and pop retailers. And I think that we do applaud everything that you're trying to do, because we too are very concerned with theft, and the organized retail theft is something that we are very concerned about, much different than the typical shoplifter. So where we would like to just caution you is to look at what our loss prevention committee is talking about. If you raise the threshold, if you double it, they're afraid we're going to double our losses. If you triple it, we're going to triple our losses. And our unique perspective is that in the grocery industry, we've got about a 1.5% profit margin. That's on a good year. So it's even more important for grocers to stay alive, for you to be aware of those thresholds and what the organized retail folks are coming in and getting us right now. The kind of items that they are targeting are the easy household items, the high-dollar household items like the oil of Olay creams, the razors, any kind of thing that they can fence easily, and that's being ripped off in just an amazing way. So I remember sitting in one of our loss prevention committees, and one of the directors from Walgreens said that he has arrested the same gentleman 57 times. 57 times, because the gentleman stays under the threshold. So these are organized people. These are not just shoplifters trying to come in and steal a few dollars. These are organized professional criminals, and those are the people that we are really asking you to consider when you're making your decision on the thresholds. And we were hoping to bring the Publix loss prevention director today to talk to you, and he got called down. His father is in hospice and just took a turn for the worse. So we're hoping to have real life experience, but instead you have us.
No, your real life experience. I mean that, and that's. I'm aware of the margins in the food industry. I work in the insurance industry, and we're heavily regulated, and we're kept to a 6% margin, profit margin, which we think is abysmally low.
Gosh, we love that.
But in comparison to the margin in food services, vending, and so forth, I mean, it is very, very low. I don't know how y'all do it. I really don't.
Grocery retail is the lowest.
Right.
Everybody should be very happy because we are the most overstored state in the country, so the prices are the lowest in Georgia. You've got so much competition, and we'd like to keep it that way.
Point well taken. Mr.
Thank
Neal.
you very, very much.
Thank you all. Appreciate my friends. I do have a couple of questions for you. Is most of your loss being shoplifting or theft loss?
Do you want to take it?
What we would, some states don't have shoplifting statutes; they just have theft statutes. Georgia has a standalone shoplifting statute. I think probably the best way to say it is the lowest felony threshold is the one that tends to control criminal behavior. Whatever the tripwire is that they might be charged as a felon is what's in their mind. And so right now the felony $300 statute on shoplifting is the one that would be the biggest focus for us.
Okay. And I think that's an important distinction to make as we talk about this. And the bill that's before us, 1176, has $1,000 consistent for shoplifting theft. The council's recommendation was $750 shoplifting and $1,500 theft. Would that help you all?
We don't want to impose on the committee's judgment. We would think that the lower the limit, the better. Whichever one of the limits is lower is better from the point of view of controlling losses.
So 750 shoplifting and 15 theft is better than 1,000 consistent?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Another comment. A comment. I think you made this comment that sometimes small businesses being hit hard one time go under. What is hit hard?
You know, the smash and grab phenomenon that we've seen. I think the assistant DA from Fulton County has worked on this issue. She would have been here today, but she had calendar call. She sent some comments that says, Metroland's been plagued with the issue of smash and grab orders for many years. As stores have increased their nighttime security, we've seen an increase in the grab and run, even hitting it during the daytime. And that it's just going to depend on the scale of the loss and what they get hit with. But
Are you talking in this 750 to 1,500 threshold that we're talking about being significant enough to cause them to go out of business? Or are you talking about some pretty significant losses?
How many boosters are hitting you at one time?
Right.
What are they targeting? But as I sit here today, I can't tell you. I couldn't produce a guy sitting next to me and say, hey, he was put out of business. But we hear through our membership meetings of, hey, my buddy across the street got hit hard and he had to go under.
Okay.
It's really a death in 1,000 cuts, really, if you don't mind me. Because it's not going to happen in 1-2 days and so forth. It's over the course of 1 or 2 quarters. All of a sudden, you see your margin going like that, and that's a huge cost driver. Whether it's over the course of time. I think that's correct. You tell me.
Yeah, from the Retail Association, we have everybody from big retailers in South Cobb area down to very small mom and pop organizations. And at our most recent association membership meeting, it was in a general context of discussion about how bad the economy was, everything, just that theft and losses from theft are even more, potentially more harmful in the current economic climate.
Do y'all have members that are experiencing some substantial losses one time, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000, $30,000? Do you ever see anything like that with any of your members?
So let me go back to the members who raised that in our meeting and come back to you within the next few days.
Okay. And the reason I say that is because one of the council recommendations was that there's because right now all we have is just a misdemeanor felony, and that's it. We have one line that says if it's below this, it's a misdemeanor. If it's more, it's a felony. One of the council recommendations was if there's anything over 25,000, that takes on an even longer sentence, so that we have some graduated felony charges as well, sentences as well. Another comment, Ms. Kazava, you said you double the threshold, you double losses, you triple the threshold, you triple losses.
Yes, sir. That's according to the public's loss prevention director, because what he is saying, and let me just say too, these folks are getting more and more brazen every day, so they are coming in and they are understanding what the threshold limits are. So if it's 300, they're stealing 290. If it's 500, they're going to steal 490. So they're coming in. So anything that you do with this committee, they're just understanding this is what they are telling me, that their losses, if you double it, they will double. If you triple it, they'll triple.
That's assuming that everybody that shoplifts up to that maximum amount, and everybody that shoplifts will now go up to that. And
Yes, sir.
quite frankly, that's
right. I
not
totally
really
understand,
good.
and that's
Okay.
we're really not concerned. Of course, we're concerned, but we're not talking about just the shoplifters, the people who come in and just shoplift a little bit, a steak, a carton of cigarettes. We're not talking about that. But the organized folks, these are the people where we're really understanding our losses. This is where we are seeing the losses, and this is where we're coming to you and asking for you to take that into consideration.
You don't have any. You have anecdotal.
We had
You have-
specifics, and he is with his father at hospice.
Okay.
But
Ooh.
I will be happy to come and talk to you and bring this gentleman to you, bring several people to you with specifics and with real dollars.
One of the things that when the council looked at all the Georgia data and looked at what's happening in other states as well, Texas increased both theft and shoplifting to $1,500. South Carolina took both to $2,000, and neither state has shown an increase in property crimes. So,
Right.
and I understand your concerns.
Right.
Don't misunderstand me. I understand your concerns.
And I understand that, and I'm getting different information from my industry. So that's where I have to.
Let's
right.
look at
We'll
look
get-
at information.
Absolutely.
I would ask
You'll
the
bring
question
it
of
to
how, when did those reforms occur, and how much time has elapsed between the time that those reforms occurred and they've actually done the measurement, because that data collection can take as much of a year. I wonder how long the measurement has been since those reforms in those other states have occurred. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a relevant question.
And that is a good point. But one thing I'm reminded of from yesterday's testimony, Judge Boggs, as he was talking about the property crimes coming through his courts, he said almost all of those property crimes coming through his courts has been addiction-driven crimes, where people are stealing just enough to where they can support their addiction. And when we take this approach to criminal justice reform, to where we're dealing with the addiction and getting these low-level offenders that are assessed for treatment, assessed whether it's drug courts or mental health courts or whatever, whether it's the improved county correction or community corrections through probation and counseling. But there's a lot of evidence-based practices out there that get these individuals into recovery, and when they're in recovery, they're not stealing. And I think that's one of the reasons why. I think that's one of the reasons why you see that if we can get these individuals in recovery, even though we may be addressing those threshold levels, the overall property crime is anywhere from not impacted to a positive impact on our ability there. And I want to look at your numbers. I want to see your numbers.
We'll bring those to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, that goes back to where we started on this, to very much applaud the governor and the General Assembly for looking at a renewed approach on the drug problem, because you reduce the demand for theft from our establishments, it cures a good deal of the problem. And again, cannot say enough how positive so many of the ideas are there. And to touch on my bases here, this goes to, we owe you specifics, but Target's loss prevention program asked that we give you a statement here that Target recognizes that states and law enforcement are struggling for resources. States should consider focusing on repeat offenders, criminals, or ORC, organized retail crime. when reforming the felony thresholds. Professional criminals are aware of the felony level and commit theft or fraud valued just below the threshold to avoid a felony charge. Again, that doesn't go to the details. We're going to get back to you. But we've had some meetings. Frankly, our retailers prefer to do those in one-on-one settings because it's a
I understand.
proprietary problem.
Yeah, I understand. Just one back to a comment I made a minute ago. The 750 shoplifting and the 1,500 theft is probably one of the reasons the council came up with that instead of the consistency was they thought through those implications of having that lower threshold on shoplifting, and I agree with you on that. I think that 750 and 1,500 is better than a consistent 1,000. But I do. If you could get some numbers to me, that'd be great. Thank you.
I'll push back a little bit on that. In that the consistency, just for the sake of consistency, if it doesn't have make sense in a real world impact, then you need to go ahead and rethink it. And I'm the first one to say so. By the same token, while you can have individuals who, going back to the drug problem, my sense of it is that that's a purely, that's the individual, desperate individual shoplifting randomly here and there, and it's a very separate conversation from organized retail theft. That is a very different conversation. Now, are the employed boosters of the organized syndicates, are they doing this to support their drug habit? Maybe. If we can go ahead and get to them, that's fine. Are they less likely to go ahead and be part of this, organized retail theft in the future? Sure. Is there still going to be a very vibrant organized retail theft sector in our economy? You better believe it. So it's, while there is absolutely a component, there's always a drug component. It always goes back to drugs. I fundamentally believe that. But that doesn't take away the reality of these organized theft syndicates and how we're going to treat that. And again, from the real world impact of the actions that we take. It doesn't mean that a $1,000 consistent standard across the board is correct. It doesn't mean that at all. But we have to recognize, and we just simply can't stick our heads in the sand on the real world impact to our employers out there. Will Home Depot survive regardless of what the threshold is? Of course it will. But the question is, what kind of impact do we want to have, and do we want to go ahead and strike a balance on that? Individual problems, absolutely. Is that is that going to go ahead and just make organized retail theft go away over the course of time? Not a chance. It'll be here long after we're gone, I promise you. Mr. Jacobs.
And in that regard, I was just curious as to, obviously you don't have your data person from Publix here, to your loss prevention person from Publix here today, but will the data show us the differentiation between what is organized and what is, more petty and individual?
Yes, sir. We've got that so that I think when they show you the figures, I think that they've got enough information that you're going to enjoy and understand that when you see it, that it'll be very clear. Like that,
this proportion of the overall loss is related to people who repeat 57 times, or
right.
Right. Thank you.
And a lot of this is going to be subjective, but they have gotten enough proof on certain cases that they can show you just which cases that they have actually gone through and shown that this is organized retail crime, and this is what we'll bring to you.
Okay. It'll be interesting to correlate, thresholds that we see in the law with real-world data. So I'm very interested to see it.
And we appreciate anything that this committee can do to lower our crime. Will lower our grocery prices too. So everyone appreciates that.
Do you promise that?
Well, no, I shouldn't say that. No. Okay. Can I erase that? No.
All right. Well,
we'll keep them low as they are currently.
Okay. All right. I'm glad we got that qualifier at the end. Let's take a real 5-minute break.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Melanie Velez. I'm an attorney with the Southern Center for Human Rights, and I work with Sarah Tatachi, who is unable to be here today but sends her regrets. We at the Southern Center for Human Rights support the bill overall. We're grateful that Georgia leadership has prioritized criminal justice, and we hope HB 1176 is the first of many steps toward a just and more effective system that improves public safety and reduces recidivism. I expect that after my testimony, I believe others have signed up to testify, including GACTL, and we at the Southern Center support their position, as well as the position you'll hear from the Georgia Justice Project, who I believe will speak to the issue of expungement legislation. We support, in particular, Chairman Neal's version of the expungement legislation. And I won't say further about that because I believe others will address it in further testimony. We also support the testimony that I believe you hear from Ms. McKinney from Voices from Georgia's Children, who'll speak to how children in particular should be treated differently under this bill in certain ways. This brings me to the main point we at the Southern Center would like you to consider, and that is indigency. We urge the committee to consider including language in HB 1176 that permits consideration of indigency when imposing or calculating costs for electronic monitoring for probation and parole. For your reference, that can be found, I believe, at page 49, line 1706, and page 58, line 2027, which references both electronic monitoring and GPS services. As you're aware, many indigent people are involved in the criminal justice system. NLADA approximates that 80% of people accused of crime cannot afford lawyers. Our concern stems from the fact that, as the committee has expressed numerous times, that when people are released or assigned to probation or parole, that they have every opportunity to succeed, and that we make every effort to cut down on the numbers of individuals who are recidivist. Saddling people who are indigent with the high cost of electronic monitoring can make it much harder for them to get back on their feet. We at the Southern Center receive, as you know, many telephone calls from individuals who are incarcerated, and that includes calls that where people describe to us the hardship imposed by the high cost of electronic monitoring. The fees, of course, vary from company to company, but we believe this is something the committee should take into consideration. There's precedents for this in Georgia statutes already, in particular 42-8-110, which is the DUI statute for payment of ignition interlock devices, 42-8-111, condition of probation, which also references DUI alcohol or drug use risk reduction program, and lastly 17-6-1.1, which references electronic pretrial release and monitoring program. Each of those statutes contains language which permit courts to take into account an individual's indigency when determining whether to impose additional costs on the individual. And we urge the committee to reference those sections and adopt similar language. Lastly, we applaud the inclusion in this bill of the earned compliance credits for probation and parole. It's a great opportunity to incentivize individual growth and more efficiently use state resources. As you're aware, the average probation sentence in Georgia is twice as long as the national average, which causes large caseloads that stretch probation officers thin. The inclusion of the earned compliance credits enhances motivation, and I believe we at the Southern Center really believe that it'll also help parole probation officers better handle their caseloads. I believe there was testimony yesterday in which an individual expressed the heavy caseloads and the difficulty that probation and parole officers face in handling their caseloads. And with that, I'll conclude unless there are any questions. Thank you, Chairman Golick, for your time and for convening this session.
I see no questions, but thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Let me call Sandra Michaels and Jack Martin with on behalf of the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Ms. Michaels and I are here representing the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and we have some overall comments we'd like to make to the committee and some specific suggestions about sort of practical, as you call them, rubber meets the road types of issues. We've provided the committee this morning with a memo that I prepared late last night describing some of those things, and yes, sir, and referring you guys to some specific issues. I do believe it's worth mentioning or worth pausing for a second to remind ourselves of the problem that we're facing. We know that the corrections budget is now closing in on $1.5 billion. That's 3 times what it was in 1990. I was on a sentencing commission in the early 2000s under Governor Barnes, and the big worry at that time was that the prison budget, the prison population would pass 50,000. And we got to do something, otherwise it's going to go over 50,000. But we've blown by that. We're way over 56 to 58,000 now. We heard this morning we have another 40,000 people in county jails. Estimates are that either maybe as early as 2014 we'll have 60,000 people in jail if we don't do anything. We have another 5,000 children in state custody. 20% of those are girls. So we have a tremendous prison population. We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the country, and we do not have a lot of good bang for our bucks for it. We're not a safer state for it, and we're not doing things as intelligently as we should be doing. We know that if we don't do anything, we're going to probably need to build 2 or 3, maybe 4 new prisons, about $80 million each. That would be another $260 million or so to the budget, and that's just to build them, not to operate them. So it doesn't behoove us, as maybe some of the comments from the prosecutors yesterday, to say, well, I'm just reluctant to reduce these sentencing ranges because my constituency will get mad or whatever, because what you're doing is passing on the expense of that to the state. It's easy for a prosecutor to say, well, we want these tough sentences, or judge, but somebody's got to pay for it, and we've got to pay attention to that. We also, as we all know, we got like 25%, most best estimate, of the prison population is mentally ill. The prison system is the largest mental health operation we have in the state. Most estimates indicate around 20% are severely addicted. I mean, not just moderately addicted, severely addicted people. And we're not using our money very wisely. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal, which interested me the other day, indicated that in New York City, by changing different policies, mainly police policy, they've reduced burglary, murder, and armed robbery rates by 80% since 1990. At the same time, reducing the prison population by close to 25%, saving almost $2 billion. Texas has also done more innovative. Hawaii has done innovative things in this area. It's time for us, high time for us to get on the train to doing something about this problem, which not only is a financial, as we've already made, an unsustainable financial problem, but also we're not getting the good public safety that we should get out of the system. 30% of prisoners are recidivists within 3 years. That's not a very good system. We're doing something wrong. We can get more money into community programs, into alternative courts, and such as drug courts and mental health courts, veterans courts. We'll have a much safer society, and we can somehow sustain or bring under control. I mean, if we can just stop the increase, that would be a major victory. We need to do more than that, but if we can just stop the increase. Right now, if for example, some of the things that the prosecutor suggested yesterday about drug offenses being 1 to 5 on a first offense, we keep doing that, we're not going to stop the increase. If we don't change the burglary convictions, and those are the 3 drivers that have been identified by those who knows from the Department of Corrections figures: burglary, theft, and drugs. Those are the 3 drivers of this that can be controlled by experts who tell us we collapse some of these wide-ranging sentencing disparities where we have sentences like 1 to 20, 1 to 30, which have been in Georgia for so long. So that's just a preamble to some of the things, and I know that you guys will be working through, and I just hope as you go through this that you pay attention to those people who have got the data and the expertise who can tell us what will really work as to reducing the prison population and what won't work. Let me, in fact, it might be useful to go down the my cheat sheet, or whatever you want to call it, that I gave y'all as some specific problems that I see and some of the things that may be fixed in the actual, or shouldn't be changed in the actual bill. The first thing that I mentioned was Director Keenan yesterday, and I have all respect for him and the work he does, talked about, he estimated that it would cost $6 million, I think is the figure he gave us yesterday, to do the weighing that would be required to structure our drug offenses along weights. Now, I just found that testimony incredible, quite frankly. And I don't mean he made it up, but I just would ask you guys to find out, where does that come from? You know, originally they told the special committee that it would be, their preliminary estimate was going to be 1 to 1.3 million. Now, before you guys, a few months later, it's now 6 million. I think maybe it's a misunderstanding of how the statute's written. If you look at line 631, for example, which is on page 18, what is to be weighed is the aggregate weight, including any adulterant or dilutant. Now, I agree with the suggestion that was made yesterday that that probably be better phrased as a mixture. A mixture is a better word. But what that means is, and this is what happens in the federal system. I've handled drug cases in the federal system, as has Ms. Michaels over the years. And all that means is you don't have to divide up each little thing that you're going to test, as they mentioned. You take that bag that comes in, you put it on a scale, you weigh it, you write down the number, and then you take a sample from that bag and put it in the machine, and the machine tells you whether it's a drug or not, or what type of drug it might be. That's all that happens. It's hard for me to imagine why it would cost $6 million for the GBI crime lab simply to take that bag, that aggregate weight, what they talk about, that whole bag, put it on a scale and weigh it, and write down that number on the report. FBI reports have that all the time on it, and it's very commonly done. It's not any type of specific purity that's being required here. That would be more complicated. But the aggregate weight of the item that had been seized, or it was whatever that was ever submitted to the crime lab. I don't understand why this would cost $6 million. You know, and quite frankly, it might cost a couple $100,000, but that would just be chump change in what we're talking about here, and the savings we would get.
I'm trying to remember the director's response on that. I mean, I know the response when we asked him that question, and he said it was personnel and equipment. And then we got into the line of questioning regarding the individual baggies. You know, if you had that, from a practical consideration, what I think I heard, subject to being corrected, is that, you know, a lot of times you're going to have these smaller bags as opposed to the larger bags of whatever it is, and that it would necessitate each individual bag being, you know, weighed and so forth. That's what I think I heard.
But I don't understand that. If a person is seized, a person stopped in a car, and they're a seller or whatever, they have a whole bunch of little bags. They've divided up for whatever reason. The aggregate weight of everything that person had would be weighed. I don't understand why you just don't weigh the aggregate weight. That's what the statute says several times. Each time in here it talks about the aggregate weight. And it says including any mixture. You don't have to bring out a certain little amount of it. It's whatever is mixed with. So it's maybe mixed with some sort of powder or whatever. The aggregate weight is what's to be weighed. Scale, I mean, the scale can't be that expensive. If they need, I'm sure they already have a bunch of scales there. I just don't understand. It's hard for me, and maybe I ask you guys as you go forward, and to get really a specific from the GBI as to exactly why you're saying this huge cost is going to be incurred, given the way the statute was written. Now, if the statute was written regarding purities and things like that, then yeah, that could be expensive. But it says the aggregate weight, you weigh it, you test it, and you don't test the whole amount. You take a sample and you put it in the machine and you test it. To me,
there's something about that bothers me from it can't be that simple standpoint, and maybe that's just the cynicism of a 14-year veteran. But I just don't understand. I'm having a tough time, and I don't want to interrupt your testimony
Sure,
and
no
go to a
problem.
prosecutor and get into a potential quarrel right here, but I mean, we need to vet that out, but
Right.
and we will.
Right.
I'm sorry.
That's
Please
all I'm
continue.
asking you to do is you go forward on this. That figure needs to be really locked down as to why that seems to be an unreasonable figure to me, and it's something that's done by other labs all the times around the country and by the FBI laboratory. I don't see why it would be such a huge problem in Georgia. The second issue that I wanted to raise is regarding the burglary offenses that are around 296 through 307. I sort of agree with the prosecutors yesterday, or some of the people who were talking yesterday, that these three levels, first, second, and third degree, may be a mistake. Trying to define a first-degree burglary, for example, talking about sunrise and sunset, that's a problem. It occurred to me, I remember I took Latin in high school, and
I did too.
Caesar always attacked at first light. You remember that? First light is before the
I've tried to
sun actually
repress the
comes up.
entire memory, but
Yeah. Well, you probably had a hard time translating that little portion, but he always attacked at first light, which is actually before the sun comes up, right? And then dusk is the same way. I mean, how does that all play? I think that is an issue.
well, isn't it true? I'm sorry, but isn't it true that don't we have other statutes in our books where we do use the sunrise, some sort of crime at night? It's not just special to burglary, is it?
I don't know that.
No.
I don't. Yeah, okay. Well,
I'm not saying the Farmer's Almanac argument of yesterday doesn't have merit. I get
Right.
that, and we get that, but it's not a unique circumstance, I guess, is my only response.
Well, I'm glad it came from the code, not from Fiddler's Roof. Fiddler on the Roof, that's right. But anyway, I think that's a problem, right? And the whole notion, there's other crimes, like is physical damage to the victim or physical harm, that's a separate crime itself, right? You can add that on to whatever burglary is. I suggest, and I think the people who are trying to figure out how we're going to actually reduce the prison population in a sensible way, say first degree and second degree burglary separated simply by whether it's a residence or not, occupied residence or not, or what is believed to be an occupied residence. 1 to 20, which is the currently Georgia law for first degree for an occupied residence, and 1 to 5 for an unoccupied residence. One of the problems, and I said out in my memo, is the problem is with recidivism rates, because the statute as written has a recidivism provision for subsequent convictions, which has a minimum of 5 years for a subsequent what I call second degree. Actually, the statute talks about third degree, the unoccupied. So the second time somebody breaks into a shed, right, they get a minimum of 5 years. Now that's going to bust. I mean, that is a deal breaker with regards to the prison population. I mean, ask the people who know this or who looked at this, and I've talked to them. That sort of throws the calculations out of whack.
And this is not a pushback, and there's a universal acceptance, and you're jumping from area to area, so we'll go ahead and I would invite members to ask, to push
Yes,
their buttons
please.
as they want to, but for questions. But as a practical, we get it on the burglary. That's a huge driver. We need to address that as it relates to dwelling, non-dwelling. We get it. Somebody doing, some kid doing X number of years for stealing a tennis racket out of a shed, that doesn't make sense. But from a practical standpoint on, the 5 years that you're talking about, that's not really 5 years, is it? I mean, what is that really in terms of the actual time in the system, given the current reality of parole board activity?
It's unpredictable, of course, what parole board's going to do, but typically a third is going to have to be served, right, before you're eligible. So that's 2 years or somewhere in that neighborhood, and so you've got that if somebody actually gives them 5 years, and of course. I know. I mean, there's a recidivism statute that I was going to. I mean, all this has to be kept in light of the recidivism statute itself needs to be looked at in the context, because we have certain recidivism provisions in this bill, but we also have a separate recidivism statute that also needs to be looked at to bring into conformity with.
And we're not insensitive to how the recidivist statute may operate, especially as it relates to a lesser crime like a non-dwelling. That's understood, and we get it on the burglary and being a driver in the system, and that has to be addressed. we're just wondering about, when somebody says 5 years, what's that really? Not that it's invalid, but that has to go into our calculation, because as a practical matter, whether you're talking about burglary or drugs or whatever, a certain sentence is not a certain sentence, because a judge is sitting there with an abacus trying to figure out how much time is this person. I do know this. They're sitting there with a calculator trying to figure out, well, if I want this person to serve 2 years, and they should serve 2 years for whatever the charge may be, I've got to go ahead and and sentence them for this, knowing the parole board's going to do that, and then I'm going to have a certain number of years of probation after that, and that's what I think I ought to do. And that all goes to our truth and that goes to truth in sentencing. So when I see a number being a 5-year min, I know that's not 5 years. The people know that's not 5 years, and we just want the truth of what the real sentence actually is, and we have to think in those terms. The judge's hands are tied because they can't control the parole board. They're trying to figure out where justice lies, and at the end of the day, they're throwing the dice on a sentence.
I agree with you, and that's always been a problem. And I always think judges think the person's going to get out sooner than they're actually going to get out.
Because they do.
No, see, that is a common misconception. Because,
okay.
I mean, that precisely is the misconception that I often have with my experience with the parole board. I'll see judges says, well, I'll give him 5 years. He'll get out in 6 months. You hear them say that all the time. They don't say it, but you hear them say it off the bench. And the prosecutors will say that. And then, okay, the defendant expects that. And then we're starting to deal with the parole board, and no, wait a second, our guidelines are this, and there's these aggravating circumstances, and your parole plan's not suitable, blah, 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 whatever it might be. And you wind up serving a third or more on sentences where everybody expected you get a lot less. I mean, one fortunate thing is we do have a statute where you can come back to the judge sometimes when you get an early enough a bad parole decision, to ask the judge to reconsider within a year. And I've done that a number of times where everybody expected it was going to be this, and it turned out not to be this. You go back to the judge. But that's a problem. I mean, I agree. But, the other problem with the statute as it's currently written is that in lines 339 through 341, they say none of these sentences can be suspended, probated, or deferred. I don't think that was intended with regards to these burglary decisions, burglary sentences. So that needs to be corrected, and I mentioned that in my...
Tell me that line again.
Lines 339 through 341. That comes from current law with regards to second or third burglary offenses.
Okay.
And that I don't know why that got in there like that. Well, it was meant to be limited to burglary first and second degree. So that's current law has that regarding second or third burglary offenses, not your first burglary offense. So that's something that needs to be thought through if we really want to go down the road. If we want, of course, it all depends on how we wind up with the first, second, and third degrees. I'm sure this is going to. Yesterday, I learned something when listening to the judges, especially Judge Boggs and Judge Bagley, about the drug and mental health courts, about how it's often not the first time to get a person in trouble. It's the person who's really got a serious addiction problem, has been around several times, that they really can get that person's attention in a drug court. We suggest, as did Judge Bagley and Judge Boggs, that line 66 on page 3 and line 162 on page 5, which says that in order for the drug court to be provided prior to sentencing, prior to the entry of sentence, that can occur only if the prosecuting attorney consents. That means the prosecuting attorney completely controls that process prior to, if it's handled prior to sentencing. And, many prosecutors, I think Judge Gosselin said that hadn't been a problem in her court, whatever. But I just don't think that needs to be in the statute. I think the judges themselves can make that judgment as to who should be available. And the prosecutor, they'll listen to the prosecutor. I mean, the prosecutor's position will surely be respected, but it won't be controlling. And I would suggest that the committee give some consideration to eliminating that language where it only, the eligibility of the drug court prior to sentencing only can occur if the prosecuting attorney consents. Let me move on to an issue that I was sort of surprised that wound up in this statute, because I thought we were talking about, reforms regarding prison populations and community corrections and those matters. Lines 811 through 814 eliminates the statute of limitations in any sex crime if the victim is under 16 years of age at the time of the violation. Under current law, if the crime occurs to someone under 16, statute doesn't run until they turn 16, and then they have 7 years. So they're 23, up to age 23. Rape is longer than that. I think rape is another 10 years, so up to 28. So you have plenty of time to report this crime as an adult. Senate Bill 316, I think, which is already passed out of the Senate committee, dealt with this in a way that's similar to other states. And it said, well, we're not going to have an unlimited statute of limitation, but we'll have one that doesn't start to run until you're 18, and then you get 10 years. So you get to your 28 to report the crime. All right? What this bill does is, under one in 1176 right now, says you can, if a crime occurs to you under 16, you can report that crime forever. There is no statute of limitations whatsoever. So the perpetrator could be 40, 50 years old. The victim could be 30, 40 years old and still report this crime. One of the areas that this has become a problem in other states is the phenomenon which is called recovered memory, where a troubled person goes to a therapist and in therapy supposedly comes up with a memory of being molested as a child that had been suppressed forever. Now, the science on that is very controversial, the validity of that. But if you allow this to happen, then anybody who has a quote-unquote recovered memory later in life can then prosecute that person for a sex crime, even though that person may be 50, 60 years old, and the crime would have occurred 30, 40, 50 years ago. There is a purpose in the statute of limitations. It's not meant there to frustrate prosecutions. It's meant to protect a defendant from trying to have to defend a crime that occurred so long ago that there's no way he can marshal a defense. Witnesses have died, memories have faded, records, credit card records that might provide a alibi or whatever are difficult to find, if not impossible. There is a reason for the statute of limitations. We endorse SB 316, which gives 10 years after 18. So the person's up to 28 years old. So the person can long be away from any danger of threats of shame or overbearing from an adult to report the crime. But to create an unlimited statute of limitations that goes on forever is a dangerous proposition, contrary to the principles of statute of limitations. And it also creates this problem of people, a teenager, for example, who could be tried as an adult, who is 13 or 14, who acting out does some act, which then when he's 40 years old is now going to be prosecuted for it long after, without any really availability to defend himself or herself. I just think that's bad policy. It doesn't have any place in this bill. I would suggest eliminating it from this bill and let SB 316 go forward to handle that problem, which does increase the statute of limitations by a significant amount, but it is a dangerous proposition. And also, if we don't want to get in the area of having people being prosecuted by recovered memories in this state, I just think that's a mistake. Here's another, going down my list of technical problems.
If we could, I hear you. If it's a technical problem that we're looking sort of at a high level, structural, philosophical approach. If it's a technical issue, please submit it and we'll work it. And
this is
look
more
at it.
I maybe understated by saying it was technical.
Okay.
It is an important issue. with regards to the victim impact at probation termination, which is at lines 1770 to 1778 on pages 50 and 51, that says before you can terminate a probation in any case, the victim has to be notified and given an opportunity to make a presentation. Current law allows that for sex offenses, 1710(1)(a)(5)(a). To put that on all offenses, no matter what they are, no matter how much, how difficult it may be to find the victim, maybe out of state, maybe long gone, is a terrific burden on that process, which we think is unnecessary. With sex offenders, okay, that we understand that because of that curious relationship, but I think that may be an impediment to that process moving quickly. Some high-level things which maybe this bill may be too early to deal with, but the report of the Special Counsel of Criminal Justice recommended that there be created some sort of safety valve for certain minimum sentences such as drug trafficking offenses. Drug trafficking has minimum sentences which cannot be probated, deferred, and they're mandatory. And that's not in here.
I know.
And that may be just because I heard you say one time that it might be not time to address that at this point. Maybe something we can consider later. I don't know. But that's something that drives the prison population that needs to be considered. And it was a recommendation of the council. It is not, Mr. Chairman, I will agree with you, it is not a driver. The figures are not as high as they are for burglary, theft, and drugs. But it is something to consider not only for this reason but for other purposes.
Respectfully, I'm looking at a list of the top 10 list, the top 10 admissions to the state system in trafficking in 2010, and trafficking is not there. Burglary, ag assault, forgery, first degree, possession of cocaine, theft by taking, theft by receiving stolen property, sale of cocaine, possession of marijuana with intent, possession of gun by a convicted felon, and robbery, in descending order.
And I will agree with you. This will not save us financially, but it is something that needs to be addressed at some point for other reasons, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I do think, though, with regards to minimum mandatories, is something that can be considered perhaps as a first step, and maybe this is not the time to do it. The 440 cases, the juvenile cases, where a child can be prosecuted as an adult, child as young as 13, can get a minimum mandatory sentence under the 7 deadly sins and serve a long adult sentence even though they're a teenager. There is a lot of research that indicates putting a child in an adult prison for a long time at that age not only educates them as to crime but inculcates them in that lifestyle. That would be an area, I think, that maybe some attention, maybe not this round, but as we go forward as the committee, as the council goes forward to address down the road. Not so much for prison population reasons, though it would have some effect on that, but for good crime control reasons and good sociological and penology reasons. And that is an area that I think we can address. And I've mentioned that in my memo as one other area that is of concern. Regarding heroin, I believe that maybe the prosecutors misunderstood. I don't see how that is less than 4 grams is no longer a crime. I think they were misreading what paragraph meant, but I put that in my memo as to, I don't think that is a problem that needs to be fixed, but I may be wrong.
We had some drafting errors that were due largely to time
Sure.
crunches, but I think we all know what the intent is there, and it'll be fixed and redrafted.
And finally, with regards to the drug offense ranges, the council recommended a presumption of probation for first offenses. That's not in the bill. And the bill talks about, for first offense, 1 to 5.
On possession and sale, or just possession?
Just possession. Talking about possession. And And it says 1 to 5 for first offense possession. I think they were recommending 1 to 2. That is an important, maybe I've mentioned this before, but that is something that needs to be looked at again, that 1 to 5 for that first time offender possession. That range can be collapsed to a great savings for people who don't need to be in prison.
Well, isn't the real issue, and I'm going to call Mr. Neal in a second, isn't the real issue, I just saw his line, I apologize. Isn't the real issue there not so much the first and second time offender, but it's really when you're getting into your third and fourth and what the range is there. I took a lot of notice of Mr. Head's testimony, which was not contradicted by anybody, I think, yesterday, that where your driver is there is going to be on your third and fourth, where you're talking about some big-time ranges of someone who may just be an addict. And may is a big word in this debate. I mean, it's really not the first and second. Your point's taken, but that's not where the rubber hits the road in terms of cost benefit for the system, right?
Many people on first offense are going to get probation. I
mean, as a matter of custom and practice, they get probation.
But there are aberrants, and I am told by the people who, I've talked to these people who, that is a problem, keeping that so wide that you have those prison sentences that shouldn't be there. I don't think there's any need to make it 1 to 5. I think 1 to 2 makes a whole lot of sense at that level. And if it can save us 100 or 200 inmates, that helps us a lot. I don't see why it should be so high at that point. That's only my point.
Let me call Mr. Neal, because he's been very patient. He's probably had this light flashing for longer than I realize. I apologize.
That's no problem.
Actually, this is a perfect time for me to come in, because I was going to talk about those possession drug offenses. So well done, Mr. Chairman.
That's the first one I've gotten in a while.
When you're talking about drug possession, and we heard yesterday that typically it's 4 or 5 offenses before individuals end up incarcerated on possession. Now, I know if there are other things that go along with those possessions, it changes it changes the way you handle those offenders. But in your experiences, is that consistent with what you all have seen, or?
I don't know. When they say 3 or 4, that's a little much to me. First time in court, probation's likely. I mean, let's face it, but not always. And second, third, you're starting to get where judges are thinking about this person needs to go to jail. In my experience, and I won't tell you that I am like a public defender is handling these cases day in, day out like this. And so I don't have that type of experience. Maybe others can speak to that more clearly. But I do know the people who tell me who've studied this, that there is aberrance in that, and that is a driver of the prison population. And the recidivism rate is a problem. The recidivism penalties that can be tacked on as you go along.
Okay. And I know this isn't in the bill, but you've touched on the mandatory minimums.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to talk to the judge about this, but since you're up here, I'm going to ask you about it.
Okay.
What is a realistic expectation that judges are going to utilize a safety valve? Would that be something that if it's in there, you would expect would be a very unusual circumstance that probably wouldn't happen, or do you anticipate that could be used enough that it becomes a problem? Or
let me speak to her and let Ms. Michael speak, because she handles a lot of these cases in federal court where they have a safety valve. There is a safety valve for certain sex offenses, and there are certain criteria that have to be met before those can be, the safety valve can apply. I think that's 1710 6.2 C1, which I've mentioned in the memo with regard to juveniles. That is used from time to time, because there are these 10 years minimums for certain sex offenders in which the crime is really not that aggravated for whatever reason. And I've seen judges do that, and that's a good procedure, because it gives the judge certain standards that they have to meet before they can do the safety valve. The current safety valve for drug trafficking is only if the prosecutor says you're providing substantial assistance. That's the only safety valve currently under the law. So it's a tool for prosecutors to drive people to cooperate. Now that should remain part of the law. I mean, I'm not saying that we should go away, but I think there should be other ways that a court can get around it. Now, Sandy, why don't you address it like in federal court?
Just on the sex offender law, I mean, that's to petition off the requirements of the registry and so forth, the residency restrictions and so forth. Is that what you're talking about?
No, you can actually, if for example, in a statutory rape case, if there was no harm to the victim, if there was no, I forget the 5 standards, 4 or 5 standards that you can get below the statutory minimum if those are met. The primary one is whether that there was any physical violence or harm. Okay. And it's in this total, it's discretion of the judge. It does no requirement that they go beneath it, but there's a provision there for that in the sex code.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
And Ms. Michaels, if you could
microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I was a federal public defender for a number of years, and I'm on the criminal justice panel and get appointed cases. We have, in the beginning, there was when the sentencing guidelines were imposed. There was it rapidly increased folks receiving, even if there's their first offense, even if they were, the traditional mule of carrying drugs, of very high penalties. So the Sentencing Commission passed a safety valve in the federal code, and it involves they have to meet certain, I believe it's 5 requirements. I'm not looking at them, but 1, they have to plead guilty. It's not like they can't say I didn't do it. 2, they have to provide a statement of their involvement. This is what I did. It cannot have any violence associated. They cannot have really been in possession of a weapon. There can be no danger to anyone. And it has to be, they have to have a criminal history of Category 1, which allows, the way it's drafted allows for maybe 1 minor previous conviction, but generally no previous conviction, before the judge can go below the mandatory minimum. And then the only other way, and that's called the safety valve. That's the safety valve. The only other way to get below mandatory minimum in the federal is if you cooperate with the prosecution, and they'll file a motion for that. So, getting to your question, Representative Neal, because it's so tightly drafted as when it applies, it's pretty much going to happen only when those circumstances arise. And as a general rule, I think good federal defenders will present reasons why the judge should do it. The age of the defendant, their circumstances, the factual aspects of the crime, that, or whether they were induced to do it. Oh, the other thing is they couldn't really have been a leader. They couldn't have been a leader of the group. They generally need to be a lesser participant in the crime before the federal safety valve will apply. And these factors are all considered by a pretrial services officer who prepares the report, and then it's vetted before the judge whether this can apply or not. And it's usually, like I said, very factually strict, and it either applies or it doesn't. But as you may know, a couple of years ago, because of I think of the burgeoning federal prison population based on drug cases, and for a variety of reasons, a third issue, beyond cooperation, safety valve, was the courts, unless it was a statutory mandatory minimum as opposed to the sentencing guidelines, the courts then found ways to go below the guidelines when they find circumstances are present that the particular defendant should not be serving such a lengthy sentence. So I know that we have gone back and forth between the prosecutors and the defense and the folks working on the commission about how should a safety valve apply. And I know, based on my talking to the prosecutors and the defense lawyers have been working on this issue in the last year, one of the sticking points is the prosecutors want them to have a final say-so on whether the safety valve applies. In the federal code, it's the judge that has the final say-so. It doesn't require the permission of the prosecution. And I know that's been a sticking point of it going forward.
I'll tell you these.
So the DAs want the approval, not just input in the process in your conversations with them?
My understanding, based on those that have been working on draft safety valve language, was the defense wanted the federal model, the prosecutors wanted the federal model with the actual, and I don't mean to speak for them, but I understand the sticking point has been the requirement that the prosecution has to agree to it before the safety valve. And the federal, they don't, it's not a but for, you'll get it. It's fact-driven, not permission-driven.
The safety valve section, as I looked at real quick, is no prior conviction, no deadly weapon, no similar transaction, no intentional harm during the commission, no transportation of the victim, and the victim was never physically restrained. If you met those criteria, the judge then had the authority to depart below the minimum mandatory and probate or split the sentence.
And that is a good point. It is discretionary with the judge. It's not. It is a discretionary thing. They don't have to do it. Should I address my part? And one thing, following up on Jack, that was Jack's part. And one thing I think most of you, and I think I've spoken to everyone present today and almost everyone yesterday, except for you, Representative Jacobs, I'm sorry. But I had emailed a couple days ago on February 29th a memorandum that would go in conjunction with HB 663. And this addresses particularly Section 5 of, or Part 5 of this, the Bill 1176. And Marissa McCall-Dodson is going to speak to the specifics of the record restriction law.
Let me just ask you, we
Yes.
do have other witnesses, so if you could wind up with that.
I'm actually just going to ask that, and I'm going to send out the memo.
Not the second, but I just don't.
No, that's fine. I'm actually going to because I've talked to y'all about it. Y'all know what I'm talking about. HB 663, I will send it out again with the, we did not have it electronically, the LC, the sub, it was not available. So I will send out the memorandum, which goes in conjunction with the LC 295171 ERS, which was vetted through the committee process this year, subcommittee of Representative Setzler, and is substantially House Bill 402, which passed, I believe, unanimously, Chairman Golick, out of House Judiciary Non-Civil last year. So this is a completely vetted piece of legislation that we are asking replace Part 5 in 1176. And I'll let others address the problems.
Let me clarify on that. And Chairman Neal is to be commended for his efforts on 663 both this year and last year. I've said to people publicly that portion of the bill is still very much a work in progress. The fact that language was substituted into this draft, people shouldn't take too much away from that. It's still, my understanding is that there's support, broad support for the concept. My impression, and the administration can speak for itself, my impression is that the administration understands that it's an important issue. The House certainly understands it's an important issue. Senator Hamrick and the Senate can speak for themselves, and I'm sure they will. That's, as I said, this bill is a work in progress and a starting point. That particular section is included in that comment. There were some aspects, and it did go through a subcommittee of non-civil on the House side. There were some aspects in the bill that came of the substitute that came out of subcommittee that, from a practical standpoint, were just unworkable and almost absurd. Therefore, just from a drafting standpoint, there is a feeling to go to another model. That doesn't mean that model is the be-all and end-all. And as far as I'm concerned, just speaking for myself personally and for no one else, I would anticipate that there would be some changes to that as well going forward. So just to make sure that's clear.
Thank you.
Ms. Deborah Nesbitt with ACCG. Ms. Nesbitt, did you want to make some comments? I saw your name here. Okay, thank you. We do have a hard stop at noon, so I just want to make sure we give everybody an opportunity who wants an opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here for the last 2 days. I know it's been a long 2 days, and hearing from all of the stakeholders, and most especially thank you from hearing from the boots on the ground folks, the people who are actually there working in the counties doing this work. I just wanted to speak to a couple of issues. Yesterday when the judges spoke, I just wanted to kind of stand up and amen everything they said. But in particular, one of the items that we're concerned about, the counties heretofore have supported the drug court movement. Really, they have been the ones that have pushed that forward. Over the last 20 years, those courts have been implemented, and some of them through federal funds. There are fees that are paid by participants that help to support those programs, and a little bit of state money. But for the most part, the counties are operating those programs. And they have really kind of woven those programs into their county government structure, if you will. And they operate just as a department of the county government. So when you talk about mandatory policies and procedures, the judges spoke yesterday about having a chilling effect, maybe with judges wanting to implement new programs. I can tell you that that is going to have a very chilling effect on local government. We feel like we've been doing this, and to have somebody come in and now say, as you know, counties shy away from the word mandatory or mandate, and taking away the flexibility for what works for those communities is going to have a chilling effect on those county commissioners as the court folks come to them and say, we'd like to implement this program. If they feel like there are going to be really stringent policies and procedures or rules under which they have to operate those programs, it may have a chilling effect. We know that, as with any grant funding, that there are going to be requirements for that grant funding. They go into that with their eyes wide open, and that's how many of them started these drug courts. And I think you don't really need the word mandatory in there to get the point across that the funding is going to be tied to you meeting these specific requirements, and everybody understands that, and that you need to provide data and those kinds of things. I just think the mandatory word's a bit strong. And I would again echo Judge Bagley's comments yesterday regarding the flexibility for how the programs are operated. As you know, every community is different. The constituency in every community is different. And what they expect from these programs may vary from community to community. One last point on the drug court, and then I'll just move on to a couple other points, is when you talk about the work group that's put together for the drug courts, the sheriff is not included in that work group. And I think that's going to be very important as we move into this criminal justice reform, because the sanctions in drug court are indeed a few days in jail. You heard the judges speak to that. And we're going to have a lot of folks in the community now, probationers that have been revoked, that are sitting in the county jail. And so I think the sheriff really needs to be a part of that team. They have to support the drug court, and that really is going to be one of the sanction tools that the judges have for compliance in the drug court. So I think it's important for the drug court team to be aware of what's going on in the jail. And I do think we're going to have some significant issues with jail overcrowding as we implement this criminal justice reform. And we are just like the sheriffs. We're on board. We realize this needs to be done. But there are some real consequences at the local level for the shifting of these offenders from state prison into the local communities. So I just wanted to mention that I thought that they should be included in the work plan. You talked yesterday about incentive funding at the local level, and we would love to see more. What is that going to look like, and what is it going to be for? As you know, we've had a huge problem with mental health services in this state, and Oliver talked about earlier. The issues we had with the reform, with the mental health reform, and we still are having issues. We still can't get a list of where those crisis stabilization units are. I've asked for 4 months for a list to put on our website so that our county commissioners can access that information. So, our fear is we're going to be faced with those same issues as it relates to services for these offenders in the local communities. When you talk about shifting drug offenders back into the community to receive treatment services, are there treatment services there? And are they structured enough to be effective with these offenders? So I think it's really important for you to look at that and know that those services are in place, because if they're not, we're going to be faced with a huge public safety issue. If we don't have structured treatment services in those local communities, those folks are not going to be successful. And so that's a very key. You're not going to have a drug court in every community. But there are going to be offenders there. So that was one point I wanted to make, that we really are shifting a huge number of cases, and we really don't have a way of determining what the exact number of cases is going to be. But when you raise those thresholds, and we agree they need to be raised, But that's a whole shift of a huge caseload down to a county level court where we have to provide the judges, we have to provide the staff, we have to provide the jail, we have to provide the probation supervision. And so that's going to be a big impact at the county level. And we don't really have a way of assessing that. So to help us deal with that, we're going to need to be sure that we've got the mental health services and the substance abuse treatment services in place to help deal with that population. So I just wanted to make that point. We agree on the 24-month sentence that would, on the high and aggravated misdemeanor, that would allow more time for those folks to pay those fines back, more time for them to participate in DUI courts, because again, we're going to have a lot of misdemeanor offenders now that we formerly did not have to deal with, and we think these alternative programs will work well in the misdemeanor level as well. And that in long term, that's really going to impact your prison population because those are your baby felon folks. They're the ones that are going to end up in the system. If they're, it's a good way to intervene earlier. Chuck Spayhouse talked about the pretrial program fees. I think that would really go a long way in helping the local community set up some innovative diversion programs to deal with some of these folks that are going to be coming into the county jail. So we'd encourage you to look at raising that cap just so that we can get some additional operational cost. There are some folks who have started those programs and have been very successful with them. And with that, everybody has pretty much touched on everything. Again, we didn't have a lot of discussion about substance abuse treatment services, and they're sorely lacking around the state. And we need structured treatment service. And there was a lot of talk here about accountability for drug courts and for how they operate. There needs to be some accountability for treatment providers as well. Are they using best practices in treating the offenders? So with that, I'll take any questions. I don't want to take up too much time.
For the interest of time, I agree with almost everything you say, and applaud you for recognizing the importance of the treatment and the services. And I think the thing that is critical for us to realize is that until we do something to curb the cost of corrections, we'll not have the funds to be able to provide those community services. And that's one of the commitments of the council, one of the commitments of the governor, is that we're going to bend the curve on corrections costs so that we can do a better job of taking care of those community-based services. I just had one question I wanted to ask you. When you're talking about the drug courts on the county levels, and clearly every county that has a drug court loves their drug court. The role of the county in the drug court, the role of the locals in the drug court and buying into the drug court is a huge component that determines in a large degree the success of those drug courts. There's no question about that. Have you given any thought at all, or how would you feel about, or maybe you can't answer and you need to talk about it a little bit, but when we're talking about our local county date funds, and those funds are restricted in how they could be used, if those funds were opened up to be available in the accountability courts as well as another avenue where those funds could be used, is that something that you think would help, or at least a conversation you'd be interested in having?
Yeah, we support that. And I think in a lot of the communities where there are drug courts, they are accessing a large portion of those date funds as well. There was a bill a couple of years ago that I worked with Chuck Spayhouse on to actually expand the number of offenses to which the date fund attached. As the code has changed over the years, some of those drug cases are not specifically referenced in the date statute, so that surcharge doesn't attach to all of them. So I think that may be something you want to look at, including in this legislation, and then that would increase some of those dollars.
If there are gaps in the collection of date funds, we absolutely need to look at that. And then I'm even interested in looking at the opportunity to utilize date funds for your coordinator or administrator of the drug court. Not right now. It has to be used for services that are I'm interested in even opening that up to where the drug court coordinator could be funded out of that as well.
We would support that.
Those are the type of things. I want to have more conversations with you about date funds, because I think that helps us with some of those concerns. First of all, I think we're going to be able to provide, but that clearly makes it easier to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I remember that. I think either Preston Smith and or Mike
Yes.
Boggs
Yes,
carried that.
that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do remember what you're talking about. Thank you, Ms. Nesbitt.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it. Mr. George Langford with the VFW. And I think we are going to go ahead and get through everybody who wants to speak.
Chairman, everybody thinks these are funny hats, but I'm going to put on a funny
Nothing
hat.
funny about it.
All right.
Nothing funny about it. Very serious.
If you don't mind.
You earned that hat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lynn Adam with King & Spalding is also here.
Welcome.
And I'm glad. If I may, very quickly, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity.
Certainly.
Let me tell you very quickly, I know we're near the end of your time frame, that as far as I know, all the congressionally approved veteran service organizations endorse veterans courts. And we think it's a wonderful idea, and if I may speak from my world, I come from the world of veterans advocacy. I was Director of Claims for the Georgia Department of Veterans Service. Previous to that, I was Director of Veterans Programs from the Labor Department, so I come from veterans advocacy. Currently, I'm Legislative Director for the VFW in Georgia. If I may, in a paragraph, say this. When these guys are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and fully 1/3 of them have post-traumatic stress disorder and TBI, they have a significant blemish.
Would you tell us what TBI is, just to make sure it's clear?
It is traumatic brain injury. It's called the signature injury of Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, fully 1/3 of these guys coming back have this problem. So when they come back and they're presented with, as a result of PTSD and TBI, with domestic violence, drug problems, alcohol problems, they've got two problems. They've got a significant problem to deal with, and then the court system to deal with. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible from our perspective. Ms. Adam knows way more about the court stuff than I do. And she has worked on legislation, and I'm so proud of King & Spalding. And let me tell you, veterans organizations are not used to really terrific law firms like that be willing to assist in something like this. So we're very proud of King & Spalding for being so involved and so helpful.
Well, there's a reason why they're number one.
I think if I would just say there's a need for veterans courts, all the congressional veteran service organizations endorse it. And if I may say something very directly to the need and the goodness, there's goodness in this. Let me tell you what the goodness is. The goodness is this. If the court division decides that the veteran who's been determined to be a veteran by the Department of Veterans Affairs or the Georgia Department of Veterans Service, that's the way the King & Spalding law firm folks have looked at it, if they will agree through a memorandum of understanding with the VA to sign an agreement that they will go through a substance abuse program, a counseling program that the court division agrees to is accredited and a good program, a successful program, one with history. And actually the VA is the very best at this in the business dealing with these guys. If they will do that and be successful, then I guess the term is there won't be an adjudication of guilt. I hope I've used the right term. But I think we would have made a significant statement for these guys. This is crucial, it's important, and let me tell you, there's nobody in this business, veterans advocacy business, that isn't in favor of it as far as I know. Or if they are, they're not real people from the veterans advocacy business, let me say that.
Well, I give really 99.9% credit to Governor Deal on that. For
that was my next sentence. Thank you, sir.
Oh, sorry, because that, you know, we as these courts have organically grown, drug courts, DUI courts, mental health courts, veterans courts is a new phenomenon. and a relatively new phenomenon as compared to the others. And I think it took a lot of leadership to take it and rise it up, to that level of perception. And the governor really, he deserves the credit for that. That's just a fact.
And that's what ignited our interest, or added to our fuel to the fire there. It helped us, and we were excited about that. Ms. Adam can speak much better to the way the bureaucracy would be set up, and the claims divisions would be created. The firm has worked on a bill, and then I think they decided, well, really, we need to talk to you folks. So let me introduce Ms. Adam.
Sure.
Thank you, George. Thank you for your comments. Representative Golick, Dwight Davis sent you an early draft of some legislation for Veterans Court divisions, and I've brought with me a revised draft just to make it as easy as possible for the members of the committee to consider how you can make this part of HB 1176. So the revision reflects the changes that you all have adopted, at least to date, on HB 1176, and I'll be sure to get copies to you all for your consideration. In addition to this not only being a good thing and a way for our community to say to our veterans, we're going to honor your service, and we are not going to drop you like a hot potato when you come back to civilian life and get in trouble with the law. And if a court finds that the aggressive behavior is related in some form or fashion to TBI or PTSD or chemical dependency because of chronic pain, the court would have the option in those cases to send the veteran to treatment. And the beauty of these programs is the treatment, by and large, would be funded by the Veterans Administration. So we're taking the funds that otherwise would be spent by state and local government units on treatment or incarceration. And those funds now are going to come from the federal government. And so all accountability courts, of course, save money in terms of reducing the cost of incarceration. But this one saves money because the treatment is actually provided by the federal government. So that's an essential feature of this type of program. And as you know, they have grown organically around the country. There are veterans courts in almost every state now, and there are 8 states that have adopted legislation. So we, in preparing a bill for your consideration, we started with the mental health court statute and the drug court statute, and then we looked at other legislation that's been enacted in other states, and we tried to pick, and choose the best of the policies and procedures, and that's what we've prepared for you. So I'll be sure to get you copies. And
thank you.
King & Spalding is ready to work with you in any capacity as you see fit.
Thank you. Let me just commend you on behalf of the committee for working with the veterans community on that. That's big firm lawyers sometimes get undue criticism from a perception standpoint, so it's always good to see the big firms step up and take some time, and time being the most valuable commodity that we all have, and giving some time back to those who have sacrificed and need help, frankly, on behalf of the nation. So thank you both for your testimony.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Neil.
Just one second, if I could. Thank you. One of my concerns as we were trying to do accountability court statewide is how difficult it is to get access statewide to the accountability courts that we're trying to implement. So a question I have, and I may be off base on this, may not be possible, but where we have I guess what I'd like to know is where we have existing drug courts or mental health courts, where we're expanding those. Is it possible we talked yesterday about tiered courts. Is it possible to attach these veterans to the existing drug courts and mental health courts and still access those federal funds, or does it have to be set up as a separate accountability court to do that?
Mr. Neal, that's an excellent question, and there are obviously many options for doing this. I think the way that most courts handle it now is they're seeing veterans in their drug courts and mental health courts, but they're not getting VA services. Veterans have special needs. A lot of them either deny they have a problem, or they know they have a problem, but they won't admit they need help. The Veterans Administration has a whole staff of what they call VJO coordinators, Veterans Justice Outreach Coordinators, who are available and standing by to help courts to get veterans into programs, and I don't see why they couldn't do that within the framework of a mental health or drug court division, but that's to my knowledge, not really happening now. There are courts in Georgia that are trying to set up separate dockets just for veterans, and that is important to do because another component that makes these programs successful is to have veteran mentors, and we would want to draw on the VFW and other resources to develop mentors for veterans going through these programs. That's an essential component. So,
when we're looking at what we're doing with criminal justice reform, which is trying to figure out how to most efficiently and effectively use state dollars to hold people accountable in the best practices way, the evidence-based way, to provide for the public safety. And when we're looking at doing the most we can with what we have, it seems like to me that we might be better off within that structure of drug courts and mental health courts. Although I know there's some nuances there that are not present with someone that's not been in Iraq or Afghanistan. But I want you to look at that. And I'm not saying please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying I don't want to see veterans courts. I want to see us provide services to the most veterans we can with the funds that are available. And if we can do that better by tagging drug courts and mental health courts and having a division of those rather than trying to set up new courts, I'd rather tag those so that we could provide those accesses or those services to more veterans. So let's look at that and see if we can.
Absolutely, I understand your point, and we'll be happy to take a look and see if we can work it into that framework as it exists now.
Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you. Let me call on Marissa Dotson and Doug. Is it Amar? Is that right? Yes. With the Georgia Justice Project. And then is there a Ms. Lynn Thomas here? Okay. Is it Lynn Thomas here? Okay. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much for allowing us to speak today. I'll introduce myself briefly and give some comments. I know you know, and everyone in the room probably knows that I'm going to speak to the expungement or the record restriction pieces of the bill, but I wanted to at least let you know where we come from and what we're doing and why this issue matters. I want to commend the committee for taking on such a task in reforming criminal justice in the state of Georgia. I think that there is a key segment of the population that we have to be concerned about while we're dealing with this, and those are people who never are convicted of a crime, who never get sent to a prison, who aren't ever on probation or parole because the charges, for one reason or another, were never brought and proven against them. And what we want to be able to do with these individuals is get them to work, getting them accessing opportunities, and getting them to be able to move on from those unproven allegations. Now, the bill that we talk about with House Bill 663 that is sponsored by Representative Neal, as Ms. Michaels mentioned, has been around, the language has been around for at least 2 legislative sessions. It's substantially similar to 402, but 663 tries to respond to this issue by bringing Georgia's record restriction law more in line with the goals that we are trying to reach here, which is to allow these individuals who are competent, willing, and able to be able to access and compete in job markets without these unproven allegations keeping them from those type of opportunities, and also dealing with the process of record restriction in Georgia, which is actually a very difficult task, costly, time-consuming, and onerous. I lead the Coming Home program at the Georgia Justice Project. It's a 3-tiered program. We deal with direct service, where we are helping individuals to navigate the current processes of record restriction and correction, as well as advocacy to employers and housing authorities where there have been a denial based on the presence of a criminal record. And what we are finding is that the process takes well over a year. It can cost up to $75 per arrest to deal with, and we wanted to create both, expand the types of cases that qualify for record restriction so that more individuals who have not been convicted can qualify to have those records unavailable. And let me be very clear with this. We are only talking about restricting these records in pre-employment background check. We are talking about potential employers and not for any criminal justice purpose whatsoever. The bill is very clear. I think it's lines 218 through 220 or about in there. I'm happy to call upon that if I need to. But we are trying to be very clear with the intent here, which is that this does not pose a risk to public safety, that the records are not destroyed or unavailable for the purposes of criminal justice. We are only talking about pre-employment background screens where there isn't a correlation necessarily to the arrest and whether or not the individual was guilty or not. I know many of you already know a majority of companies use background checks. 90% of the companies who use companies on a national study use background checks and pre-employment inquiries. And 63% of those employers say that they will use an arrest that did not lead to conviction to make an adverse employment decision. Now, how does this affect the state of Georgia? The state of Georgia suffers if these individuals who have been charged but not convicted can't get access to employment and can't thereby take care of themselves and their families. We're asking them either to receive some form of state assistance to be able to live on and or partake in criminal activity to take care of themselves. We must respond to the need to get people working, and that's what 663 tries to do. So a couple of places where I want to make sure that we're clear with the types of cases that we're talking about in 663 and where record restriction will be available for and restricted to potential employers. For example, acquittals. In Georgia right now, if you go all the way and you're found not guilty of the charges, not guilty of all the charges that are against you, do not qualify for record restriction. 663 allows record restriction for potential employers if someone is found not guilty, but also recognizes that there may be times where the record shouldn't be restricted and allows the prosecutor to be able to motion the judge to make those determinations. And we list out some factors based on the inadmissibility of evidence, or if there is something to do with a witness, the unreliability of a witness. That came up in conversations with prosecutors about this issue, that there may be a situation, for example, in a child molestation situation or something like that, where because of the delicate nature of the age and maybe other issues that are going on with the family, that they weren't able to secure a conviction of the offenses, but that that there may be a reason to keep those records there. And we want to make sure that the judge is able to hear from the prosecutor to understand those issues and make those types of determinations. Another area that isn't covered by record restriction under current law is the idea of a no bill. When the grand jury refuses to accept formal charges against the individual, to indict them or to accuse the crime, it never even gets to indictment. Under our current law, these individuals who receive no bills from the grand jury are not able to have those records restricted for employment purposes. Some other areas, and I don't need to go through all of them, but the other place that I want to spend some time on and be clear about is the issue of open arrests, these cases that happen pre-indictment or accusation and before they ever reach a prosecutor. And I will actually tell you where that is in the bill so that we can look at that together and make it a little bit easier. It is on page... It is lines 1082 through 1099 on page 31. It's the section is C1, and it deals with cases that were never referred to the prosecution. What we are talking about here is cases that the arresting agency, what we're seeing now at the Georgia Justice Project is people will come in with open arrests that are 5, 10, 15 years old and want to know how they can get those records expunged. Well, there is no mechanism to have open arrests that never made it to the prosecution restricted. So we've created the ability for those records to be unavailable to potential employers after a certain amount of time. 2 years for misdemeanors and 4 years for felonies. I want to be clear with this, that this is not about stopping the prosecution from being able to prosecute the case. We are not involving the statutes of limitation and infringing upon their discretion to prosecute these cases at all. What we're talking about is cases that aren't ever even given to the prosecutor. And cases that are just sitting in the arresting agencies, after a certain amount of time, we think that these individuals shouldn't have to deal with the negative consequences or the denial of opportunity based on charges that aren't even in the wheels to be prosecuted. So those are some big pieces, and I'm happy to go through the other areas that we are trying to include with 663. I don't know that we need to do that now, but I want to spend some time talking about the workability of the bill and the work that's been done with other agencies and other individual stakeholders involved in record restriction. So, like I said, 402 was very similar. That passed out of the full Judiciary Non-Civil Committee last year unanimously. It's very similar. In fact, 663 is almost a better working document because it includes some work that we needed to do with regards to the clerk's issues and how they may be able to carry out the restriction of their records, and I'll come back to that in a second. But when we're talking about workability of this bill and workability of the record restriction sections in 663, I want to be clear and tell you that we've had conversations with the clerks of court, the chiefs of police, the Sheriff's Association. The GCIC has been very involved and helped us to understand the language and how changing the language is going to affect their ability to carry out what we were asking them to, even so much as how much it will cost if they need to implement the programming changes that are here. So I'm actually kind of confused to hear that some parts of it may be absurd or unworkable, and I'm more than willing to deal with those pieces of it, because the last thing I want to do, or the Georgia Justice Project wants to do, as the only agency that I know of in the state that's handling expungements and records issues the way that we are, is make the law worse for ourselves. So what we're trying to do with this process is automate it, make a lot of pieces of it more automatic, and make it a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more beneficial to the individuals by making the process automatic at GCIC level and by the arresting agency. What 663 says is that upon the entry of a qualifying disposition, so that, if it's an acquittal situation or a certain type of dismissal, once a disposition is entered into GCIC, GCIC issues a notification to the arresting agency to let them know that this was a qualifying record and qualifies for restriction, and requires that the arresting agency also restrict access to their information. I will tell you that our current law says that, and I know that this is not actually being carried out in practice, but the current statute says that the records are supposed to be destroyed by the arresting agency. They're supposed to destroy the fingerprints, the mugshot, all photos. I know a lot of agencies aren't doing that, and frankly, I think that there may be some value to keeping those records around for various purposes. So 663 does not go as far as our current law does in mandating the destruction of records, but instead just the restriction of access to them for employment purposes. We're good? Okay. The other pieces to the process that are very important to understand is how information is being accessed, how it is being used against individuals in Georgia who haven't been convicted. The law is inconsistent. Georgia's record restriction law is inconsistent, and I actually provided you all with the key substantive changes that 663 proposes.
We're looking at it right now.
Yes, sir, and the chart here. So the issues with the way that people are the way that information is being used against individuals is simple. Our record restriction law requires that our current law requires that GCIC and the arresting agency restrict access to the record. Does not say anything about the records at the clerks of court, doesn't include the records at the jails and the detention centers, and in this new technologically advanced area that we find ourselves in terms of accessibility of information, the fact that those doors are wide open means that the idea of record restriction in Georgia is a falsehood. It's a misnomer, because as long as the information is available, official records are available, then restricting them in certain areas but leaving them available in others does not satisfy the purpose for which record restriction was intended. And so what 663 does is bring Georgia in line with the rest of the Southeast, as you can see from this chart, and include the clerk's records in restriction and make them unavailable to the public, which in turn allows consistency of access of information both at the local level and at the state level. And the big issue there is The question that we've heard is, what difference does it make if the information is already out there? Once you ring the bell, it's out there. The issue is that there's federal law that protects individuals from having this information just have to be out there, and the private companies, often, most of them, I don't know of any of them that don't have a mechanism by which you can challenge information in their database, and by letting them know or letting them have to reinvestigate, as the Fair Credit Reporting Act requires, by making them investigate the record that they are disseminating. By the official record no longer being available, we are in turn telling the private sector, Georgia is restricting access to this record, and thereby allows individuals remedy with these private companies. And yes, sir.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure. And I'm from California. I know I talk fast, so if I'm going too quick, just let me know.
I spent part of my growing up not in Georgia and up in the north, and I can't compete with you. There's no on the clerks of court piece. There's some concern about the interface there, about the again, going back to the practical, included in the practical application of that for the clerks of court, cost that goes into that. Speak to that a little bit,
Sure.
if you could.
Absolutely. What we heard from the clerks was, you may remember, Chairman Golick, that the first round of 402 had an automatic restriction for the clerks, that we just thought that, when the records are restricted, that the clerks should restrict their records too automatically. And the clerks' pushback to that was that workload would be unmanageable for us, and that's not how we operate. How we operate is we need a judge to order our records restricted, and we do it all the time. And we're very clear on how to seal records, but this is, 402 as it was written wasn't the answer. What they asked us instead was, if a judge just tells us we have to restrict access to the information, then we'll do it. So what we did was change the provisions in 663 to respond to that request, to make it so that individuals, and it's not automatic, it requires that an individual petition the court and allow court to hear the case and determine whether those records should be restricted. And only upon the order of the judge to order the clerks to restrict the record do they act. And from what I've understood from conversations with the clerks, that is not any different than the work that they're already doing. And what we were trying to do here is to apply the same rules and principles to the criminal records that are already available to civil records, such as in the adoption context and the divorce situations, other areas where the juvenile records, other areas where records are sealed. We wanted to mirror. We've been asked by judges when we request this kind of thing be done. We need some statutory direction here. We need to know how, whether or not we have the authority or how we're supposed to seal criminal records, and so that's what we were trying to respond to with that.
I think I can maybe help clear up a little bit of the confusion with the clerk of courts too. What we were originally trying to do was we were telling the clerks how we wanted them to do it, and they were saying we can't do that. We finally just said we just want to where somebody can't come in and get that record, and they said, oh, well, we can keep it separate by having a separate file, whether it's their software or their records. We have a separate file that includes those restricted, so that's only available to the individuals that are supposed to have it, but it's not available to the public. So when we quit trying to tell them what we wanted them to do and tell them what the ultimate effect was, they said, well, we already have the ability to do that. So I think the clerks are okay now.
That's my last conversation with them was gave me that impression.
Well, we'll, as I've said earlier, we'll regroup on that issue and sort of clear the air. I think there was communication is key in this environment, yes, and we're in the lack of clear communication in a timely manner, we err on the side of caution.
Yes, sir.
That being said, we're going to be here for another month, so there's time to go ahead and clear the air and talk about the art of the possible.
Sure.
So, okay.
The only other piece that I know we'll be talking about this for a while, so I'll save it. But the only other piece that I want to make sure that I talk about today is what 663 does in regards to the prosecutors. And we've met with the prosecutors several times. I think that we have tried to address the technical concerns that we could, and have agreed to disagree on some of the substantive issues and the procedural issues. 663 eliminates the power of the prosecution to make those determinations as to whether record restriction is appropriate. we don't think that that power should lie in the prosecution. We believe that the prosecutor as adversary should be able to make, give some input where there is some gray areas, such as the trial situation I talked about, where there's an acquittal, where there's a dead docket, and there's some extraneous situations that may be at issue that need the record to be publicly available for a longer period of time than is required by 663. The idea of a conviction being reversed. Those are places where we understand that there may be a need to discuss, a need to decide, a need for some give and take. We just think that, and when those areas arise, we think that decision should be made by a judge and not the prosecutors, and that's a bone of contention. I don't think we're going to be able to solve that particular issue, but I will tell you that the prosecutors and the right to make those types of determinations and being the decider, if you will, on whether an individual who has not been convicted should have to suffer the negative effects of that record being on their criminal history forever. No other state in the country gives prosecutors that power. So I would just ask that the committee consider that power and that role of the prosecutor. And while I'm a defense attorney and I understand very clearly the communities that they represent, the interests that they have, I just believe that we should have to be able to have some clear statutory requirements as to when record restriction is appropriate, and where there is a case-by-case decision that should be made, that the prosecutor doesn't make it, but instead that a judge is able to.
Okay. I appreciate your time. I'm sorry to have to hurry up, but we have one more witness, and I want to be fair to everybody.
Thank you.
Your points are well taken.
Thank you, Chairman Goldberg, for having me.
Let me call Ms. Savannah Potter Miller. Good morning.
Good morning, Chairman Gullick. How are you? Thank you very much
for
allowing me a few minutes for this opportunity. I am Savannah Potter Miller and a past president of the Georgia Association for Women Lawyers. I'm also here today as the committee chairperson of the American Bar Association General Practice Solo and Small Firm Division, which represents small firms and solo practitioners around the United States. The American Bar has established a commission, or a task force rather, of the specialized court judges in support of Veterans Treatment Court. So I'm here today speaking in support of Mr. George Langford, who I know very well from the VFW. I am also a member of the American Legion Auxiliary, Post 294, and represented the American Legion Auxiliary of Georgia at the Judicial Conference of the Court of Appeals of Veterans Claims in Washington. I'm admitted to the Court of Appeals of Veterans Claims in Washington, as well as the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. I'm also the mother of a captain in the United States Army, and that's why I got involved in representing disabled veterans, and have been doing so since 2005. In 2010, I represented a disabled veteran, 100% disabled veteran in Cobb County State Court, who was a Vietnam veteran, 100% disabled. He was rejected from the court-appointed attorney's office because his 100% disability check exceeded the financial guidelines of the court-appointed attorney's office in Cobb County. However, his wife had seen me representing another disabled veteran, and I agreed to represent this particular veteran. He was charged with DUI, driving without license, driving without proof of insurance, and several other driving charges. Based upon my relationship, having represented disabled veterans on appeal, I contacted Commissioner Pete Wheeler's office, Commissioner of the Georgia Department of Veteran Services. His aide, Mr. Cook, directed me to the geriatric psychiatrist at the VA hospital on Claremont. We were able to get this veteran in the geriatric psychiatric program. We were also able to convince the judge to use as a substitute for his state-imposed probationary the substance abuse program that the VA had. The judge also reduced his fines, in fact, made his fines nominal if he successfully completed the geriatric psychiatric program at the VA, as well as the substance abuse program. He was later sent to another program that the VA had. So what I did was to establish a veterans treatment court for that one particular veteran, which took about 6 months to do that, to work successfully with him. So that is what Mr. Langford and attorney from King and Spalding are suggesting. The bottom line of how this veterans treatment court can really work. It can really work when the VA is, the Veterans Administration, the Federal Veterans Administration is involved on a more general and organized level than just one person being involved. So what I'm suggesting is that this Veterans Treatment Court, as been proposed by the governor in the accountability courts, has to serve more than just the Afghanistan and Iraqi veterans, but there are hundreds and hundreds of veterans who are Vietnam veterans, Korean veterans, who need to have this type of program, which will assist in the lifestyle of the people of Georgia. So with that in mind, I am in great support of it. To answer a question that has been raised, the district attorney in Kings County, New York, Mr. Hines, who is the former chairperson of the criminal justice section of the American Bar, if you look at his website, he has veterans, a direct relationship in his drug court that the district attorney's office supervises, the drug court in Kings County, Brooklyn, New York, with the various VA agencies and private agencies that will support veterans in a treatment program. So this is a very important thing, especially there. I understand Commissioner Wheeler has stated that there are over 700,000 veterans in the state of Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Potter-Miller. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Okay.
I apologize. There was another witness, and with all the lines and checks and so forth on the sign-up sheet, I missed it. Let me call on Polly McKinney with the Barton Child Law and Policy Center.
I'll try not to take it too personal.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I was just thinking it's not as bad as the time I got forgotten in traffic court and sat there for 5 hours and found out I was third on the list. That was painful. This was much better than that. I'm Polly McKinney, and I'm actually the advocacy director for Voices for Georgia's Children. And we are a member of the Just Georgia Coalition, which includes Barton, Georgia Appleseed, and ourselves. And I'm speaking on behalf of the coalition today.
Okay.
I'm going to be very quick because I'm hungry too. I bet
Thank
you guys are hungry. And I just want to thank Mr. Martin for already bringing to light SB 316, which we also support putting into Section 3.2. Although our reasons are similar, basically the basis for that support is because kids who commit sexual offenses are less likely to be chronic offenders than are adults who commit the same offenses. Many kids can be acting out or just responding to their own abusive situations. So without a statute of limitations, a child who commits a one-time act at the age of 13 or 14 could be prosecuted at 40. And we have some concerns about that. And we don't feel like it serves the best interest of justice if the child has outgrown, bad behavior or poor choice. So that, just in a nutshell, that's the first 2 pages I was going to read to you guys. And we also are looking at Section 7.4, which currently requires that a child who's 15 years or older be transferred to an adult court for fourth burglary. And I just want to say that, automatic transfer to an adult court is one of the most stringent tools we have in our juvenile justice toolkit. As you know, it's generally only used for the most serious of crimes, the 7 deadly sins. And as we move to differentiate burglaries of different types, we should ensure that only the worst type of burglaries result in this serious response. As currently drafted, HB 1176 says that automatic transfer would apply to the fourth burglary in any degree. If we keep the current structure of the bill for the degrees of burglary, we would request that this provision only apply to the fourth burglary in the first degree. And as was discussed yesterday, as we move to a distinction between burglary of a dwelling and burglary of non-dwellings, we would ask that the provision only apply to burglary of a dwelling. Under this structure, if a prosecutor still felt strongly that a child who had committed multiple non-dwelling burglaries needed to be sent to adult court, this would still be possible through the discretionary transfer provisions under 151130.2. Thus, making this change would not prevent the prosecution in adult court for these low-risk offenders. It would just make it discretionary rather than mandatory. So we believe that this change would be in keeping with the spirit of the overall reform package in reserving the most serious punishment for offenders who truly need it. And that's my nutshell version.
I love nutshell versions. Thank you.
That's my best thing.
Thank you. And your point's well taken on the fourth. And we again, that in striving for uniformity and consistency, sometimes you're going to have some gaps, and that's a perfect example of it. If we're looking at juveniles, on a fourth, okay. A fourth is a fourth, but a fourth going into a dwelling as opposed to a non-dwelling, there is an obvious difference there, and that's point's well taken.
And I think you were talking about, what was your abbreviation yesterday?
Stupid teenage male.
Yeah. This kind of falls into a lot of that.
Understood. And, but a fourth of anything is a strong signal. I don't care what it is.
Yes.
But if we're back to the consistency, if we're looking dwelling, non-dwelling anyway, and in a juvenile context, there are safeguards there, and the prosecutors may have a little bit of pushback there, or maybe some safeguards that they'd like to put in, but that's certainly on the table and reasonable.
Yeah, I think we just need to have it be part of the conversation.
Sure, and it is.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate everyone's time and input. Invaluable last couple of days, in my opinion. I hope it's shared by the members who are here. From a practical standpoint, I think we've concluded our testimony. Well, we have concluded our testimony on this. I don't anticipate that we would have any more hearings on it. Realistically, given the fact that we have days 29 and 30 coming up next week, and then the period of recovery that goes along after that, I don't think realistically we would get to a markup until the week of the 12th, and to be truly realistic, not really until the week after that at the earliest. But I do anticipate that we will get there, and my hope is that we get there sooner rather than later. I think the issues are very clear. The fixes are easy. Some of the policy points have to be worked out, and that's what compromise is all about. So, and members and interested parties will get plenty of notice as to when a markup will occur. My hope is that a substitute will be circulated prior to that in order to get feedback. Just because we've heard all the testimony and a substitute and an agreement gets forged, I think it's good to go ahead and get a draft out there for some feedback for those issues that we may have missed. Just because we miss them the first time doesn't mean we're not going to miss them the second time. And then to get some informal feedback from there, and then probably go to a markup, I think is realistic. So with that, let me thank everyone for their time and attention, and we're adjourned.